Chapter 1. The calculation happening before you finish your first sentence. You walk into a room, before you speak, before you think, before you even decide how to stand. Something has already happened. A judgment has been made, not slowly, not thoughtfully, not fairly, instantly, within seconds. The people around you have already decided what you are to them, not who you are, what you are. And that distinction is where everything begins. Because what they decide in that first moment doesn't just shape how they see you. It determines how they treat you, how much attention they give you, how seriously they take you, and whether you matter at all in that space. This isn't about first impressions in the way it's usually explained. It's not about smiling more or fixing your posture or rehearsing better introductions. Those are surface-level adjustments to a much deeper process. What's actually happening is faster, colder, and far more efficient. The human brain is built for rapid social assessment. It doesn't wait for full information. It can't afford to. So it compresses everything, your appearance, your movement, your presence, into a set of immediate conclusions. And those conclusions revolve around three silent questions. Not spoken, not conscious, but always there. Are you a threat? Are you useful? Or are you irrelevant? Everything else is decoration. You can feel this in certain moments, even if you've never named it. The way a conversation shifts when someone higher status enters the room. The way attention sharpens or disappears, depending on who is speaking. The way some people are listened to immediately, while others have to repeat themselves just to be acknowledged. That shift doesn't happen randomly. It's the result of this initial calculation. And the most important part, the part most people miss, is that this process is not logical. It's not based on your actual abilities, your character, or your intentions. It's based on signals, micro-signals, the way you enter space, the pace of your movement, the tension in your shoulders, the steadiness of your gaze, whether you hesitate before speaking or assume the right to be heard. These are not details. They are data, and the brain reads them with precision. Consider a high-pressure scenario. A boardroom, 10 people seated. One person arrives late. No introduction. No context. Within seconds, everyone in that room has already adjusted to them. Some lean back, slightly, observing. Some glance briefly and return to their notes. One or two track every movement. Why? Because each person has already placed that individual somewhere in their internal hierarchy. Not consciously, not deliberately, but decisively. And once that placement is made, behavior follows. If you are perceived as a threat, not necessarily dangerous, but disruptive to someone's status, people become alert, more attentive, but also more guarded. They measure their words. They monitor your reactions. There's an undercurrent of tension, even if the surface remains polite. If you're perceived as useful, the energy shifts differently. There's engagement, interest, subtle investment. People lean in. They ask questions. They remember what you say, not out of generosity, but because value attracts attention. And if you are perceived as irrelevant, something quieter happens. Nothing. No resistance. No engagement. Just absence. You are acknowledged, but not registered. Present, but not included in the mental map of what matters. This is where most people spend most of their time, and they rarely realize it. Because irrelevance doesn't announce itself. It hides behind politeness. A nod, a smile, a brief response, but no real attention. And here's the part that changes how you move through every room from this point forward. This initial judgment happens before you have the chance to demonstrate anything real about yourself, before your intelligence is visible, before your competence is proven, before your personality has space to exist. You are being evaluated on incomplete data, and that incomplete data is enough. This is not a flaw in the system. It is a system. The brain is optimizing for speed, not accuracy. It prioritizes efficiency over fairness. It would rather make a fast, imperfect judgment than wait for a complete, accurate one. And once that judgment is made, it becomes self-reinforcing. People don't just see you, they interact with a version of you they've already decided on. If you're seen as high value, your words are given more weight. Your mistakes are overlooked. Your presence is interpreted generously. If you're seen as low value, the opposite happens. Your ideas are questioned. Your tone is misread. Even neutral behavior can be interpreted negatively. Same actions, different interpretations, because the lens was set in the first few seconds. You can test this. Recall a time when someone immediately respected you, before they had a reason to. Conversations flowed. You felt space to speak. There was a sense of ease. Now contrast that with a moment where you had to prove yourself repeatedly just to be taken seriously, where every word felt like it needed justification. The difference wasn't your ability. It was your initial categorization. And once you understand this, something becomes clear. Most social outcomes are not decided during interaction. They are decided before it. What follows is simply the confirmation of a decision that has already been made. Which means if you're trying to change how people perceive you only through what you say, you're already late. Because the real conversation, the one that determines everything, has already happened silently, before your first sentence. Chapter 2, the 3-second scan, threat, utility, irrelevance. Before you finish your first sentence, the room has already decided how to deal with you. Not who you are, how to deal with you. That distinction is precise, and it explains why some people are welcomed, some are watched, and others are quietly ignored. Because the human brain does not begin with curiosity. It begins with classification. The moment you enter someone's awareness, a rapid internal scan activates. No words, no conscious reasoning. Just pattern recognition operating at speed. And within that narrow window, often no more than a few seconds, 3 judgments are formed, not layered, not sequential, simultaneous. Are you a threat? Are you useful? Or are you irrelevant? Everything that follows is shaped by which of these categories you fall into. Start with the first, threat. Most people misunderstand this entirely. They associate threat with aggression or physical danger. But in social environments, threat is more subtle and far more common. It is about status. You become a threat when your presence disrupts someone else's internal position, when you signal competence they cannot match, confidence they cannot access, or control they do not possess. You do not need to say anything for this to register. In many cases, silence amplifies it. A composed posture, unforced eye contact, measured movement. These are not neutral signals. They suggest certainty. And certainty in uncertain environments destabilizes others. So the nervous system reacts, not with conscious thought, but with adjustment. Some people will lean in, engage you early, attempt alignment, reduce uncertainty by bringing you closer. Others will create distance, become polite, but reserved, observing for weaknesses, waiting for data that lowers your position. And a smaller group will compete, subtly, often indirectly. Interruptions, dismissals disguised as humor, shifts in tone that test whether your confidence holds under pressure. None of this is random. It is management of perceived threat, and it happens before language enters the interaction. At the same time, a second evaluation is running utility. This one is quieter, but just as decisive. The question is simple. What value do you represent in this context? Not in general, not in your full life, in this moment. Can you provide access to people, to information, to opportunity? Do you carry status that can be associated with? Do you offer emotional or intellectual stimulation? Are you someone who enhances the environment simply by being in it? The brain does not articulate these questions. It aggregates signals, clothing, but more importantly how it is worn, speech patterns, but more importantly timing and restraint, social proof, often inferred from how others react to you. From this, a value estimate is formed, and then it is compared against cost. How much effort will interaction require? Will this person demand attention, reassurance, explanation? Will they complicate the environment or streamline it? If perceived value exceeds perceived cost, attention increases, conversations extend, opportunities open, subtly at first, then more clearly. If cost outweighs value, something else happens. You are not rejected directly. That would carry social friction. Instead, you are managed. Responses shorten. Invitations become less frequent. Engagement becomes polite, but minimal. Over time, access closes not abruptly, but completely. And this process is rarely visible unless you know what to look for, which brings us to the third category, irrelevance. This is a default outcome when neither threat nor utility registers strongly, and it is the most misunderstood. Irrelevance does not feel like exclusion. It feels like neutrality. People are courteous. Interactions are smooth. Nothing appears wrong, but nothing progresses. You are not challenged, not engaged, not remembered with precision. You exist in the background of interaction, present, but not influential. In high-stakes environments, this is often more limiting than being seen as a threat, because a threat at least commands attention. Irrelevance receives none. And here is where the system becomes more precise. These three judgments are not fixed labels. They are dynamic positions. You can enter a room as irrelevant and become useful within minutes if new signals emerge. You can be seen as useful and shift into threat if your competence becomes uncomfortable for others. You can even move from threat to irrelevant if your presence stops registering as impactful. The brain is updating constantly. Every glance, every response time, every shift in tone, all of it feeds a model, but the initial classification carries disproportionate weight. It sets the baseline from which all updates are measured, which means early signals are not just important, they are defining. Consider a familiar scenario. Two individuals enter the same environment with equal capability. One is immediately engaged, questions directed toward them, space given for their thoughts, subtle deference in conversation flow. The other is acknowledged, but not invited in. They speak, but are not built upon. Their presence is accepted, but not integrated. Over time, the first individual appears more competent, more confident, more valuable. But the difference did not begin with ability. It began with categorization. And once that categorization took hold, behavior aligned to support it. This is a quiet architecture behind most social dynamics. Not fairness, not merit alone. Perception formed instantly, then reinforced systematically. And here's the part that requires precision in how you think about this. This process is not personal. It feels personal because it affects you directly, but it is not driven by intention or character judgment. It is driven by efficiency. The brain is minimizing uncertainty, allocating attention, and protecting internal status, all at once. It does not wait for full information because it cannot. So it decides early, and then it looks for evidence to confirm what it has already decided, which means most people are not reacting to you. They are reacting to their interpretation of you, formed in seconds and rarely questioned afterward. Understanding this does not change the system, but it changes how you see it. And once you see it clearly, you begin to recognize that every interaction has two layers. The visible exchange, words, tone, expression, and beneath it, the silent calculation, classification, adjustment, positioning. Most people operate only on the surface. They respond to what is said. A smaller group recognizes a second layer, They watch how attention moves, how behavior shifts, how quickly someone is included or quietly set aside. And once you start noticing that layer, you realize something difficult but useful. You are not entering neutral environments. You are entering active evaluations. And in those first few seconds, before anything is explained, before anything is proven, a decision is made about where you belong within that space. Everything else follows from there. Chapter 3. The irrelevance filter, the category nobody warned you about. There's a moment you've experienced, whether you admitted it or not. You're in a conversation. You speak. The words are clear. The point is valid. And nothing happens. No resistance. No engagement. Just a brief nod. Then the conversation moves on as if you never spoke. Not rejected. Worse. Unregistered. This is a category almost nobody prepares for. Not threat. Not value. Irrelevance. And it is where most people are placed most of the time by most of the people they meet. Not because they lack intelligence. Not because they have nothing to offer. But because they failed to trigger a response in the only window that mattered. The initial scan didn't flag them, so the system moved on. The irrelevance filter is not aggressive. It does not push you out. It does not challenge you. It simply does not include you. And that absence is what makes it so difficult to detect. Because socially, everything still looks intact. People are polite. They respond when spoken to. They maintain the surface structure of interaction. But underneath, no real processing is happening. You are not being evaluated further. You have already been categorized as not requiring attention. This is where the analogy becomes precise. In most interactions, people are not meeting you as a fully formed individual. They are interacting with a simplified model of you, constructed in seconds, then left mostly unchanged unless something forces an update. If you do not disrupt that model early, you remain in it. And the default model, in the absence of strong signals, is irrelevance. You can observe this in any environment where attention is limited and competition for it exists. A networking room, a meeting, even a casual social setting. Watch where attention flows. Not evenly. It concentrates. Certain individuals draw it without effort. Others receive it only when they demand it. And many exist around the edges, acknowledged but not engaged. The difference is not always what they say. It is how they were categorized before they said anything. The irrelevance filter is efficient. It protects cognitive energy. The brain cannot deeply process every person it encounters, so it selects. And selection requires elimination, not hostile elimination, just quiet exclusion from priority. This is why you can have entire conversations that feel empty. You speak, but nothing builds on your contribution. You listen, but no one checks if you're following. You leave, and your absence does not alter the dynamic. It is not personal. It is structural, and the structure is indifferent. There is a specific kind of frustration that comes from this state, not the sharp tension of conflict, not the clear signal of rejection, but something more subtle, a sense that you are present, but not impacting anything, that you are moving through interactions without leaving a mark. And over time, if unexamined, people adapt to this position. They speak less. They defer more. They begin to pre-edit their thoughts, assuming they will not be received with weight. And in doing so, they reinforce the very signal that placed them there, because the system is recursive. If you behave like someone whose input does not matter, the environment adjusts to confirm it, not out of malice, out of consistency. This is where most advice fails. It focuses on adding more confidence, more visibility, more expression, without addressing the underlying issue, which is not quantity, it is signal clarity. The irrelevance filter is not broken by volume. It is broken by distinction. Something in your presence has to interrupt the default categorization, not dramatically, not artificially, but clearly enough that the brain is forced to reassess. This can happen in small ways. A pause before speaking that is not hesitation, but control. A statement delivered without seeking approval. A question that reframes a conversation instead of following it. These are not techniques. They are signals. And signals are what the system reads. Consider a familiar pattern. Someone quiet enters a room. They do not speak immediately. They observe. When they finally contribute, it is concise, precise, and shifts the direction of the conversation. What happens next? Attention recalibrates. Not because they became louder, but because they became legible. The brain updates its model from irrelevant to something else. This is the threshold. Irrelevance is not a permanent identity. It is a default state that persists only until contradicted. But contradiction requires awareness. You cannot change a classification you do not recognize. Most people try to solve this by increasing effort, talking more, explaining more, trying to prove value through accumulation. But the system does not reward accumulation without recognition. If the initial category remains unchanged, additional input is filtered through it, meaning even strong contributions can be overlooked because they arrive from someone already marked as background. So the shift has to happen earlier, at the level of perception, before the conversation gains momentum, before roles stabilize. This is why certain individuals can enter a space and, within minutes, alter how they are treated without revealing anything substantial about themselves. They are not providing more information. They are providing different signals. Signals that resist easy categorization. Signals that require attention. And attention is the gateway. Once you have it, you can shape it. Without it, nothing you do fully registers. The difficult part is this. The irrelevance filter is invisible by design. No one announces it. No one confirms it. You are expected to sense it indirectly through patterns. Through who gets interrupted and who does not. Through whose ideas are repeated and whose are ignored. Through who is asked follow-up questions and who is not. These are the indicators. Not obvious, but consistent. And once you start seeing them, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. You realize that most interactions are not balanced exchanges. They are selective engagements, where attention is allocated, not distributed. And your position within that allocation was decided before you had the chance to influence it consciously. That realization changes how you move, not with anxiety, with precision, because now you understand the cost of being unregistered, not rejection, absence. And absence, sustained over time, becomes invisibility, not because you are invisible, but because nothing you signal has required the system to see you differently. Chapter 4. The calculation is always updating. You're always being measured. You think the judgment already happened. You assume the decision was made in those first few seconds, and now you either live with it or try to overcome it. But that's not how this works. The initial scan is only the opening move. What follows is constant recalculation. Every interaction, every pause, every reaction you display is being recorded, integrated, and reinterpreted. Not consciously, not deliberately, but with a consistency that is difficult to escape once you see it clearly. You are not being judged once. You are being measured continuously. And the most unsettling part is not that this happens. It's how subtle the updates are. No one announces them. No one signals that your position has shifted. There is no moment where someone tells you, you've moved up, you've dropped down, you now matter more or less. Instead, the changes appear in small adjustments. The tone in someone's voice when they greet you. The speed of their response when you reach out. The difference between being invited early and being informed later. Nothing dramatic, but never random. Because behind every one of these micro shifts, the calculation has been updated. Consider a high-pressure moment, a meeting where something goes wrong. A plan fails. Attention turns to you, not formally but implicitly. You respond, not just with what you say, but how you hold yourself while saying it. Do you tighten, rush, explain excessively, or do you slow down, clarify, and speak with control? In that moment, something registers, not the content alone, the signal. And that signal carries more weight than the outcome itself, because it answers a deeper question. How do you behave when stability breaks? The system updates. If you contract, your perceived capacity narrows. If you expand, your perceived range increases. No announcement follows. But the next time a similar situation emerges, watch who is looked at. That is where the update reveals itself. This is how movement happens inside the hierarchy. Quietly, incrementally, often without your awareness, you can move from irrelevant to useful without a clear turning point, from useful to threatening without intending to, from respected to managed without understanding why. Because the shifts are not based on single events. They are based on patterns. Patterns of behavior under observation. And observation does not require direct interaction. People are watching you even when they are not engaging with you. They are noticing how others respond to you, how your name is mentioned in rooms you are not in, whether your presence creates ease or tension, clarity or confusion. All of this becomes data, and the system integrates it continuously. There's a specific moment where this becomes undeniable. You encounter someone who once dismissed you, minimal engagement, limited attention. Then, after a period of absence or change, you meet again, and something is different. They listen longer. They ask more. Their posture shifts slightly toward you. What changed? Not the environment, not the context. The model they hold of you, somewhere, through direct or indirect signals. The calculation updated, and now their behavior aligns with that new position. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. One strong moment can create attention, but repeated signals create repositioning. The system is not impressed by isolated displays. It is recalibrated by patterns it can rely on. If you demonstrate clarity once, it is noted. If you demonstrate it consistently, it becomes expected. And expectation is what shifts how people approach you before you even act. But there's another layer, one that most people avoid confronting. You are running the same system. Right now, without effort, you can think of people in your life and place them into categories. Those you respect, those you overlook, those you engage only when necessary. You may not use a language of threat, utility, or irrelevance, but the structure is identical. You respond faster to some messages. You invest more energy in certain conversations. You anticipate value from specific individuals while minimizing effort with others. You have built models of them, and those models guide your behavior, not because you are calculating in a cold or strategic way, but because your brain is optimizing the same way theirs is. This is what makes the system difficult to reject. It is not imposed from the outside. It is shared, a continuous exchange of perception and response, where everyone is both evaluating and being evaluated at the same time. And once you see that clearly, something shifts in how you interpret your experiences. You stop asking why someone treated you a certain way in a single moment, and you start asking what pattern led to that treatment. Because behavior is rarely about the immediate interaction. It is about the accumulated impression, built slowly, adjusted constantly, reinforced quietly. There is no fixed position in this system, only current positioning. And current positioning is always subject to change. But change does not come from force. It comes from signal, from the repeated, consistent expression of something that contradicts the existing model strongly enough that it can no longer be ignored. Until that happens, the system remains stable, even if you try to push against it, because it is not responding to your intention. It is responding to your pattern. And patterns are what define you here. Not once, but over time, always being measured, always being updated, whether you notice it or not. Chapter 5, The Invisible Hierarchy. You are ranked before you open your mouth. You haven't said a word yet, and still, the room has already decided where you stand. Not formally, not visibly, but with a level of agreement so consistent it might as well be written somewhere. Because the moment you enter any social environment, a structure forms around you, an invisible hierarchy, and you are placed within it almost immediately. No introductions required, no credentials verified, just signals read, interpreted, and converted into position. You can watch it happen if you stop focusing on what people say and start observing how they behave, who speaks without hesitation, who waits, who gets interrupted, and who doesn't, whose presence shifts the energy of the group, and whose presence barely registers. This is not random variation. It is hierarchy in motion, and it operates with precision most people never consciously notice, but constantly respond to. Within seconds, the group assigns relative weight to each person in the space, not permanent value, situational weight. Who carries influence here? Who is central? Who is peripheral? And once that distribution stabilizes, everything begins to align around it. Conversation flow, eye contact, turn-taking, even humor. A joke told by one person lands effortlessly. The same joke delivered by someone else falls flat, not because of timing, because of position. The hierarchy filters perception before content is even processed, which means by the time you begin speaking, you are not starting from zero. You are speaking from within a rank, and that rank shapes how your words are received before they are understood. This is why two people can say the same thing and produce entirely different outcomes. One is acknowledged immediately, expanded on, reinforced, remembered. The other is overlooked, spoken over, or worse, absorbed and repeated by someone higher in the structure. And when that happens, most people misread it. They think it's about communication skill, about clarity, about delivery. Sometimes it is, but more often, it's about where they were placed before they spoke. Because hierarchy precedes expression. It defines the conditions under which expression is evaluated. Now here's where it becomes more exact. Your position is not assigned based on what you claim. It is inferred from how you behave before you have anything to claim. The way you enter the space. Do you pause at the threshold, scanning, adjusting, waiting to be oriented? Or do you move with quiet certainty, as if the environment is already known to you? That difference is registered instantly, not consciously, but definitively, than your physical presence. Do you compress yourself, minimizing movement, reducing visibility, avoiding occupying space? Or do you hold your posture without tension, without apology? Again, not dramatic, but clear. And then something even more telling, your relationship with uncertainty. Silence appears in a conversation. A gap. What do? Do you rush to fill it, offering something, anything, just to eliminate the discomfort? Or do you allow it to exist, holding your position without urgency? Because silence in social environments is not empty. It is a test. And how you respond to it signals your internal hierarchy before the external one has fully formed. People who are comfortable with silence are read as stable. People who rush to escape it are read as seeking stability from the group. That distinction matters. It influences where you are placed. And then there's alignment. Watch how quickly someone adjusts their reactions to match a perceived higher status individual. Laughter that arrives a fraction too early. Agreement that comes without evaluation. Attention that becomes selective, directed upward rather than outward. These are not conscious strategies. They are automatic calibrations, and they are visible, which means they are also data. The system is constantly reading who defers, who challenges, who holds neutral ground, and from that, it constructs the hierarchy. Not once, continuously, but the initial structure, the one formed in those first moments, carries disproportionate influence, because once people agree, even unconsciously, on relative positions, they begin to reinforce them. They give more space to those they perceive as higher. They expect less resistance from those they perceive as lower. And over time, these expectations become reality, not because they were true to begin with, but because behavior aligned to make them true. This is the part that most people find difficult to accept. You are not entering neutral ground. You are entering a system that organizes itself around perception before evidence. And if you do not understand how that organization happens, you'll keep trying to influence outcomes at the wrong level. You will focus on what you say, when the system is responding to how you were placed before you spoke. This does not mean the hierarchy is fixed. It is not, but it is resistant, because it is maintained collectively. Every interaction either reinforces it or subtly shifts it, and shifts require consistency. You cannot override a position with a single strong moment, but you can destabilize it over time by repeatedly introducing signals that do not fit the existing model until the model updates. And when it does, the hierarchy adjusts, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but decisively. The same people who once overlooked you begin to engage differently, not because they chose to, because their internal map of the environment changed, and you now occupy a different place within it. But until that shift occurs, the system holds. You speak from where you were placed. You are heard according to that position, and everything you do is filtered through it, which means the most important part of any interaction is not what happens after you begin. It's what was decided before you had the chance to. Chapter 6. What people are actually thinking based on where they ranked you. You can feel it before you can explain it. The same words land differently depending on who says them. The same room treats two people in completely different ways, and nobody acknowledges it out loud, because once the hierarchy is set, something else locks into place. A pattern of thinking, not visible, not spoken, but consistent enough that if you learn to read it, you can predict behavior before it happens. People don't think about you in a neutral way. They think about you relative to where they placed you. And from that position, three distinct internal narratives emerge. If you've been placed above them, their thinking shifts into calibration. They are watching you, not casually, carefully. They track what you react to, what you ignore, what seems to matter to you. They adjust their tone slightly when speaking to you. Their language becomes more precise or more agreeable, depending on what they believe earns approval in your presence. This is not submission in the obvious sense. It is strategic alignment. They are trying to reduce uncertainty by understanding you. At the same time, something more complex runs beneath that surface. Tension, because hierarchy is not emotionally neutral. When someone places you above them, it creates distance, and distance carries cost. So while part of them seeks proximity, another part is quietly scanning for contradiction, a mistake, a hesitation, a moment where your certainty fractures, not out of malice, but out of balance. If they can find evidence that lowers your position, the system relaxes, the gap closes, the tension resolves. So their attention toward you is double-layered. Engagement on the surface, evaluation underneath. Now shift to the opposite position. If you've been placed below them, something quieter happens. Your presence stops requiring active thought. They are not analyzing you. They are not studying you. They are, in most cases, not thinking about you at all. This is where people misunderstand indifference. They interpret it as calm or neutrality or even acceptance, but it is closer to absence. Your input is processed quickly, then released. Your opinions do not anchor the conversation. Your reactions do not significantly alter their behavior. They are polite because politeness maintains social efficiency, but there is no investment behind it. And when you step outside the boundaries of that assigned position, when you interrupt, assert strongly, or claim attention that was not pre-allocated, the response is immediate but subtle, not confrontation, correction, a slight change in tone, a redirection of conversation, a dismissal framed as humor, enough to restore the original structure without creating open conflict, because hierarchies protect themselves quietly. They do not need to be enforced aggressively when everyone is already participating unconsciously. Then there is the most complex position, perceived equal. This is where most interactions that feel good actually sit, and also where the most tension hides, because equality in perception does not remove hierarchy. It stabilizes it. You are close enough in perceived value that neither of you can ignore the other. So attention increases. Engagement becomes real. There is genuine conversation, shared understanding, even mutual respect. But beneath that, something else is running. Comparison. Constant, low-level, often invisible comparison. Who is leading the conversation? Whose ideas gain traction? Who is deferred to when decisions need to be made? And because the gap is small, every shift matters more. If you succeed, it is noticed immediately. If you fail, it is registered just as quickly, not always expressed, but stored. Because in this position, movement is possible in both directions. You can become someone they look up to, or someone they begin to overlook. And both outcomes are being quietly evaluated in real time. This is why interactions between perceived equals often feel charged, even when they're friendly. There is cooperation, but also tension, support, but also silent measurement. They want you to do well, but not so well that the balance breaks. They value the connection, but also monitor their position within it. This is not hypocrisy. It is structure, the system maintaining equilibrium. Now here is where this becomes practical. Once you understand that people are not reacting to you directly, but to your position relative to them, their behavior becomes predictable. Attention from above is selective, often testing. Attention from below is minimal, often passive. Attention from equals is engaged, but watchful, and none of it is random. It is aligned with the internal narrative they're running about you, a narrative built quickly, then reinforced over time. This is why two people can experience the same individual in completely different ways. To one, they are impressive. To another, they are irrelevant. To a third, they are competition. Same person, different ranking, different thinking, and different behavior as a result. The critical detail is this. People rarely update these narratives consciously. They adjust them through accumulation, small signals, repeated over time, which means if you do not understand the narrative someone is running about you, you will misinterpret their behavior. You will take distance as disinterest, when it is actually hierarchy. You will take politeness as respect, when it is actually dismissal. You will take engagement as connection, when it is partially evaluation. Clarity removes that confusion. It allows you to see behavior not as personal, but as positional. And once you see position, you begin to understand something most people miss entirely. You are not being responded to as a fixed identity. You are being processed as a moving variable inside a constantly adjusting system. And what people are actually thinking about you has very little to do with who you believe you are, and everything to do with where they decided you stand. Chapter 7. You cannot opt out of hierarchies. You can only choose whether to see them. You can ignore it. You can disagree with it. You can even reject it entirely. It will still be operating the moment you walk into a room. Because hierarchy is not a belief system. It is a pattern of human behavior. And patterns do not disappear because you refuse to name them. This is where most people make a quiet but costly mistake. They assume that by choosing fairness, by treating everyone equally, by focusing only on merit. They have stepped outside the system, but nothing about the system has changed, only their awareness of it. And that gap between what is happening and what is being seen is where misalignment begins. You enter a space assuming neutrality. Others enter already assessing position. You speak expecting to be evaluated on content. Others are filtering you through placement. You offer ideas believing they will stand on their own. Others weigh them based on who delivered them. So while you're operating on principle, they are operating on perception, and perception moves faster. This is not an argument against fairness. It is not a rejection of integrity. It is a recognition of sequence. Perception comes first. Evaluation comes after. And if you do not understand the first layer, the second will rarely work in your favor. There is a specific kind of frustration that emerges from this mismatch. You see people advance who are not more capable. You watch contributions go unnoticed while weaker ones gain traction. You find yourself repeating ideas that only land when someone else says them. And the instinct is to interpret this as injustice. Sometimes it is, but more often it is structure, a system responding to signals, not intentions. The individuals who move effectively within the system are not always the most skilled in the conventional sense. They are the ones who recognize early that something else was in play. They notice that presence shaped perception, that timing influenced authority, that how something was delivered often mattered as much as what was delivered. And instead of resisting that reality, they studied it, not to manipulate, but to align. Because once you see the system clearly, your options change. You stop relying on being eventually recognized and start ensuring you are immediately legible. You stop assuming that consistency alone will elevate you and start understanding that consistency must be visible to matter. You stop confusing being correct with being effective and begin to integrate both. This is where people often hesitate, because seeing the system can feel like compromising something, like stepping into a game they did not choose to play. But the reality is simpler. You are already in it. The only variable is whether you are moving with awareness or without it. And awareness does not require you to abandon your values. It requires you to express them in a way the system can read. There is a difference. Treating people equally does not mean presenting yourself without distinction. Being principled does not mean being invisible. You can respect others without minimizing your own presence. You can operate with integrity while still understanding how perception shapes outcomes. In fact, without that understanding, your integrity often goes unnoticed, not because it lacks value, but because it lacks signal. And the system does not process what it cannot detect. This is why some of the most capable individuals remain on the margins of influence, not due to lack of substance, but due to lack of translation. They are operating at a level the environment never fully registers. So their impact stays contained, even when their potential is not. Meanwhile, others, sometimes less capable, but more legible, move through the same spaces with greater effect. Not because they are better, but because they are seen. This is a distinction. Visibility is not vanity. It is access. And access determines whether your ability ever enters the equation. Without it, merit has no entry point. Now, there is a common reaction at this stage, a quiet resistance. The idea that understanding the system will make interactions feel calculated, inauthentic, strategic in a way that removes something human. But that only happens if you approach it incorrectly. If you try to manufacture signals without grounding them in something real, it becomes performance, and performance is unstable. It requires constant maintenance. What actually works is alignment, where your internal state and external signals match, where your presence reflects something genuine, but expressed with clarity, not exaggerated, not hidden, just legible, because the system does not require you to become someone else. It requires you to be understood, and understanding is built through signal. Once you accept that, the resistance fades. You are no longer trying to escape the structure. You are learning to navigate it with precision. And that shift from resistance to clarity is what changes how you move. You begin to see interactions differently, not as random exchanges, but as structured environments with underlying dynamics. You notice where attention gathers, where influence concentrates, where decisions are shaped before they are spoken. And instead of reacting late, you position early, not aggressively, deliberately, because you understand that opting out was never a real option, only a comforting idea. The system continues whether you acknowledge it or not. People continue to assess, to rank, to respond according to where they have placed you. And the only real choice available is simple: to see it clearly or to keep moving through it. Unaware of the forces that have been shaping your outcomes all along. Chapter 8. The performance adjustment. How people change around you based on your category. Watch the same person in two different rooms. In one, they are attentive, precise, almost calibrated. Their tone softens, their posture opens, their timing sharpens. They listen fully, respond thoughtfully, remember details that seem almost excessive. In another room, that same person becomes efficient, shorter replies, reduced eye contact, a polite presence, but nothing more. Nothing about them changed, only who they believe they are dealing with. Because once you are categorized, people don't just see you differently, they perform differently around you. And that performance is not random. It is structured, consistent, and deeply revealing. Most people think authenticity means behaving the same way with everyone, but that is not how humans operate. Human behavior is adaptive, context-sensitive, continuously adjusting based on perceived value, risk, and return. So what you are experiencing in any interaction is not someone's fixed personality. It is their selected version of themselves, delivered in response to how they have ranked you. If you are perceived as high value, the performance expands, attention increases. They become more present, not just physically, but cognitively. They track your words, anticipate your reactions, refine their own delivery in real time. Their listening becomes active. Their responses become layered. They build on what you say instead of just replying to it. Even memory sharpens. Details you mentioned once are recalled later, not as coincidence, but as investment, because remembering you signals value. And signals are how people maintain positions within the hierarchy. There is also a subtle synchronization that begins to appear. They match your pace, adjust to your tone, align with your rhythm, not in an obvious or exaggerated way, but enough that the interaction feels smooth, almost frictionless. This is not accidental. It is alignment behavior. And alignment happens when someone believes a relationship is worth maintaining at a high level. You will also notice something else. Access increases. Responses come faster. Invitations become more direct. You are included earlier in processes instead of informed after they have already begun. Not because rules changed, because your category did. Now shift to the opposite end. When you are perceived as low value, performance contracts. Not rudely, not aggressively, just efficiently. You still receive responses, but they are shorter, less considered, delivered without depth. Eye contact exists, but does not hold. Agreement appears, but carries no real engagement behind it. And memory fades. Things you share are not retained, not because they are unimportant in isolation, but because the system has already decided not to allocate storage to them. Time becomes limited. There is always a delay, always a reason, always a soft boundary that keeps interaction at a surface level. And if you pay attention, you will see the consistency. It is not occasional, it is patterned, because the performance matches the perceived return. High return high investment, low return, minimal investment. This is not cruelty. It is economy. The allocation of attention as a resource. There's a third variation, and it is the most nuanced. When you are seen as equal, here, the performance becomes balanced but charged. Engagement is real. Attention is present. There is genuine exchange. But there is also calibration, subtle adjustments in tone, in timing, in positioning. Each person is monitoring the other, not overtly, but continuously. Not just listening, but evaluating. Who is leading? Who is influencing? Who is setting direction? The performance here is not about expansion or contraction. It is about precision. Neither side overinvests. Neither side withdraws. There is a maintained equilibrium. And within that equilibrium, small shifts matter. A slight increase in confidence. A moment of hesitation. A well-timed contribution. Each one feeds the ongoing recalculation. Because in this position, movement is possible, upward or downward, and both are being tracked. Now here is the critical point most people overlook. These performances are not deliberate acts of manipulation. They are automated responses. People are not sitting across from you, deciding consciously how much attention to give, how much warmth to display, how quickly to respond. The system runs below awareness. It selects the appropriate behavior based on a category already assigned, which means if you try to change how someone behaves toward you without changing how they perceive you, nothing holds. You might get temporary variation, but the default performance returns because the underlying classification remains intact. This is why effort alone often fails. You invest more energy, more enthusiasm, more explanation. But if your position is not shifted, the system continues to respond as it did before, filtering your increased input through the same category. So the real lever is not behavior at the surface. It is perception at the base. Once perception changes, performance follows automatically, without force, without negotiation, because the system recalibrates itself. And you will see it immediately in the tone, the timing, the attention, not dramatically, but unmistakably. This is where clarity replaces confusion. You stop asking why someone suddenly became more engaged, more responsive, more invested. You recognize that nothing sudden happened. The calculation updated, and the performance adjusted to match it. The same is true in reverse. When engagement fades, when attention drops, when interactions become thinner, you are not witnessing randomness. You are seeing a shift in position reflected through behavior. And once you understand that, interactions stop feeling unpredictable. They become readable. You begin to notice patterns that were always there. How quickly someone mirrors you. How long they stay present. How much detail they retain. These are not personality traits. They are indicators. Signals of how you have been categorized and how much of themselves they are willing to invest in your direction. Because in every interaction, something quiet but precise is happening. Not just who you are, but how much of you is worth responding to. And people answer that question not with words, but with the version of themselves they choose to bring into the moment. Chapter 9, the 4 categories: resource, threat, liability, irrelevant. Before a word is exchanged, a decision is made. It happens fast enough to feel invisible, but precise enough to shape everything that follows. You walk into a room or your face appears on screen. In a matter of seconds, the people around you run a quiet classification. Not who you are in full, just what you are to them. Because the human mind does not process people in depth at first contact. It processes them in function, in potential impact, in terms of gain, risk, cost. And almost every judgment collapses into 4 categories. Not formally, not consciously, but consistently. The first category is threat. This is where tension hides behind politeness. You are not rejected here. You are not dismissed. In many cases, you are treated well, sometimes exceptionally well, but the energy is different. There is an alertness beneath the interaction, a subtle tightening, a level of attention that is not entirely comfortable, because something about you disrupts their internal balance. It might be competence that exceeds theirs in a domain they value, a level of confidence they cannot easily mirror, a calmness under pressure that exposes their own volatility, even social ease in environments where they feel uncertain. You are not doing anything to them, but your presence is doing something inside them. So they adapt, they smile, they engage, they include you in conversation, but they also monitor. They track your reactions. They watch for inconsistencies. They look for moments where the image you present and the reality beneath it do not fully align, not out of malice, out of self-protection, because if they can find your weakness, they can reduce the gap between you and them. They can bring the internal discomfort back to equilibrium, and they don't need to act on it immediately. Just knowing it exists is enough. The second category is resource. Here, the attention you receive feels warm, even rewarding. People lean in. They listen. They respond quickly. They remember what you say. There is engagement. There is consistency. There is what looks like genuine interest. And often, parts of it are genuine. But the structure underneath is conditional, because in this category, you are valuable for something specific. It might be tangible, skills, access, information, influence, or intangible. Your energy, your humor, your ability to make others feel significant without demanding the same in return. Whatever it is, there is a clear equation being run. As long as what you provide exceeds the cost of maintaining the connection, the relationship is sustained, sometimes even strengthened. You will notice effort. Messages are returned. Invitations appear. Your presence is requested. But observe carefully when the variable changes, when you are no longer providing at the same level, when access becomes limited, when your attention is no longer as freely available. The shift is rarely abrupt. It is gradual, polite, deniable. Response is slow. Engagement thins. The reasons become practical, reasonable, unchallengeable. Nothing explicit ends. It simply dissolves. And if you are not watching closely, it feels like confusion. But the structure remains consistent. The value changed, so the behavior adjusted. The third category is liability. This is the quiet distance that often goes unacknowledged. You are not disliked. You are not attacked. But you are not chosen. Something about you signals cost. Not necessarily something objective. Sometimes it is association. How being seen with you might affect their standing. Sometimes it is emotional, an energy that feels heavy, unpredictable, or demanding in a way they do not want to engage with. Sometimes it is perception alone. But once placed here, the pattern is stable. Interactions remain surface level. Courtesy is maintained. There is no overt rejection, but there is also no investment. No one reaches for you when it matters. No one brings you into opportunities that carry weight. No one defends you when your absence makes it easy to overlook you, because involvement feels like a risk, and the system is designed to minimize risk. You can be present in the room and still be excluded from what is actually happening inside it. And the final category is irrelevance. This is not hostility. It is absence. You are not processed deeply enough to trigger reaction. Your presence does not register as impactful, positively or negatively. Conversations continue around you without adjustment. Eye contact passes over you without anchoring. Your input, if offered, lands lightly and disappears quickly. There is no resistance here, but there is also no traction. And this category is more common than most people are willing to admit. Because in environments where attention is limited and stimuli are constant, most individuals do not receive detailed evaluation. They are filtered out early. not because they lack value in any absolute sense, but because nothing about the initial signal demanded further processing. Now here's the part that matters. These categories are not fixed identities. They are initial placements, but they are powerful because first placement shapes subsequent interpretation. Once someone has placed you in one of these categories, new information is filtered through that frame. If you are seen as a threat, your confidence reinforces it. If you are seen as a resource, your generosity confirms it. If you are seen as a liability, your attempts to engage can be interpreted as further cost. If you are seen as irrelevant, your contributions struggle to gain weight. So movement between categories does not happen through volume. It happens through disruption, a clear, undeniable signal that contradicts the existing classification, not repeated effort within the same pattern, but a shift that forces recalculation. This is why some people seem to change how they are treated almost instantly in new contexts. They are not changing who they are at a fundamental level. They are altering the signal that triggers the initial category. And once the category shifts, everything downstream reorganizes. Attention changes, behavior changes, access changes, not gradually, but structurally, because the system is not responding to your intentions. It is responding to its interpretation of your impact. And that interpretation begins before you ever speak, reducing complexity into something simple enough to act on and powerful enough to define how the room moves around you. Chapter 10. The performance is invisible by design, and you cannot always tell which one you are getting. There is a moment most people miss, not because it is subtle, but because it is designed to be untraceable. You are in a conversation. It feels smooth. The timing works. The other person is engaged, responsive, aligned. You leave thinking that was real, and maybe it was an execution. This is the part that shifts everything once you see it clearly. You cannot reliably distinguish between genuine engagement and well-calibrated social performance. Not in real time, not with certainty. Because the people who are most effective in social environments are not the ones who avoid performance. They are the ones who make performance indistinguishable from authenticity. They remove friction. They remove visible calculation. They deliver responses that feel natural, unforced, almost inevitable. And because of that, your system relaxes. You trust what you are experiencing. But under the surface, something precise is happening. Every reaction you receive is filtered through an internal assessment you are not privy to. Every moment of agreement, every laugh, every expression of interest, each one may be genuine, or it may be selected. Selected because it maintains alignment, because it sustains access, because it preserves a position. And the difference between those two states is not visible from the outside. Consider the simplest example. Someone laughs at what you say. It lands well. The timing is right. The response feels proportionate. You interpret it as recognition. But there are at least two possibilities running in parallel. They found it genuinely funny. Or they recognize that responding with amusement reinforces your perception of value, and maintaining that perception benefits them. Both produce the same external signal, the same expression, the same tone, the same outcome, but the underlying drivers are different. Now extend that to agreement. Someone consistently aligns with your views, supports your perspective, mirrors your conclusions. It feels like resonance, but it can also be risk management, because disagreement carries cost. If you have been placed in a position where your approval matters, where alignment maintains access, then agreement becomes the most efficient strategy, not because they lack independent thought, but because expressing it may not serve their current objective. And again, the signal looks identical. Now consider absence, the delayed response, the postponed meeting, the polite explanation that sounds reasonable, even necessary. You accept it at face value. And often it is true, but sometimes it is allocation. You have been deprioritized, not explicitly, not declared, but quietly adjusted in the internal ranking that governs where attention flows. And the system is designed so that you cannot confirm which is which without cost. Because the moment you question the authenticity of the interaction, directly or indirectly, you introduce something that destabilizes the dynamic. You reveal uncertainty, and uncertainty in social environments is read as lower positioning. So even if your question is valid, even if your doubt is accurate, the act of seeking clarity alters how you are perceived going forward, which means the answer you receive is now contaminated, not necessarily false, but no longer diagnostic of what existed before the question was asked. This is what makes the system self-sealing. You cannot verify it cleanly from within, and that is not a flaw. It is a feature, because social environments depend on a shared assumption that what is being expressed is, at least broadly, real. If every interaction carried visible calculation, if every agreement came with an explanation, every laugh with a disclaimer, every gesture with a stated intention, the entire structure would collapse under its own transparency. So the calculation remains hidden, not to deceive in a malicious sense, but to preserve function, to allow coordination without constant negotiation, to allow interaction without continuous exposure of motive. And the people who navigate this most effectively understand something that is rarely said out loud. They do not rely on what is said. They track what is consistent. They observe patterns across time, not signals in isolation, because a single interaction can be performed perfectly, but patterns are harder to sustain without alignment. If someone is consistently present when it matters, consistently attentive when stakes are high, consistently aligned when there is no immediate benefit, then the probability of genuine engagement increases, not to certainty, but to reliability. On the other hand, if the signals fluctuate based on context, strong engagement in one setting, minimal in another, fast responses when visible, delayed when private, then you are not dealing with a stable baseline. You are seeing adaptation. And adaptation tells you that performance is being selected based on environment, not necessarily who you are, but how you are being used within that moment. This is where most people make an error. They try to decode every signal. They analyze tone, timing, phrasing, searching for the definitive answer to a question that does not have one. Is this real or is this performed? But that question, while intuitive, is strategically weak because it focuses on intent you cannot access. A more precise question is different. What pattern of behavior does this interaction belong to? Because patterns can be observed, they can be measured, they can be responded to without requiring certainty about internal motive. And this shift from interpreting isolated moments to reading consistent behavior removes the need to guess. You stop chasing authenticity as a feeling. You start evaluating reliability as a structure. And with that, something stabilizes. You no longer need to know exactly what someone is thinking in each moment. You need to know how they show up across moments. Because in the end, the performance is not the problem. It is part of the system. The real question is whether the version of the performance you are receiving is consistent enough to build anything on, or variable enough that it only exists for as long as it serves a purpose you were never meant to see. Chapter 11. The only data that actually matters, behavior over time. If you had to remove all guesswork from human interaction, strip away tone, charisma, charm, and every persuasive surface, what would remain? Not words, not impressions, only patterns. And patterns, over time, do not lie. Here is where most people get misled. They evaluate others in moments. A strong first impression, a powerful conversation, a gesture that feels unusually thoughtful. And in that moment, it feels conclusive. It feels like enough. But moments are where performance lives. Time is where truth reveals itself. Because in a single interaction, almost anyone can deliver the correct response. They can say the right thing, mirror the right energy, create the right emotional effect, especially if there is something to gain. But sustaining that alignment across time, across different conditions, different pressures, different incentives, that is where performance begins to fracture. And what replaces it is behavior that reflects actual priorities. So the question shifts. Not what do they say, not how do they make me feel, but what do they consistently do when it costs them something to do it? This is the only data that matters. Everything else is noise. Watch what happens when convenience disappears. When showing up requires effort. When responding requires attention they could allocate elsewhere. When supporting you offers no visible return. Do they still move toward you? Or do they become distant? Quietly, reasonably, without confrontation? Because distance, in most cases, is not accidental. It is chosen, and it reveals more than any explanation ever will. Now take it further. Observe behavior when there is no audience, when there is no social reward attached to being seen as loyal, supportive, aligned. Do they act in your favor when no one is watching? Do they protect your reputation when your absence makes it easy not to? This is where the signal becomes clear, because public behavior can be curated. Private behavior is harder to manage consistently, and over time, inconsistencies accumulate, not dramatically. Subtly, a missed follow-through here, a delayed response there, a moment where alignment disappears when it is no longer beneficial. Individually, each instance is explainable. Collectively, they form a pattern, and patterns define reality. There is another condition most people avoid examining. What happens when your value temporarily drops? When you are not as useful, not as visible, not as advantageous to be associated with. This is where categorization is tested. Because as long as you're providing something, attention, access, energy, validation, many relationships will appear stable. But remove the output, reduce the immediate return, and watch the recalibration. Some people will adjust their engagement downward, almost automatically. Less urgency, less presence, less interest. Again, not out of malice, but because the internal equation has shifted. Others will remain, not with the same intensity perhaps, but with consistency. They still respond, still engage, still hold position. Even when the immediate benefit is absent, this is not common, but it is decisive because it indicates that your value to them is not purely transactional. It exists beyond immediate utility, and that distinction is rare. Now, a precise clarification. Watching behavior over time does not mean becoming suspicious of everyone. It does not mean withdrawing, testing people, or turning every interaction into an analysis. That approach collapses trust and isolates you from real connection. Instead, it means shifting your weighting system. You still engage, you still connect, but you do not finalize conclusions based on intensity in isolated moments. You let time accumulate data. You allow patterns to form before assigning meaning. And when the pattern becomes clear, you adjust accordingly, not emotionally, structurally. You invest where there is consistency. You reduce exposure where there is volatility. You stop overvaluing signals that are easy to produce and start respecting behaviors that are difficult to sustain. Because consistency under varying conditions requires something performance alone cannot provide. It requires alignment. And alignment is expensive. It costs time, attention, opportunity, which is why it cannot be faked indefinitely. Eventually, the system reveals itself. Always. Now consider the inverse, your own behavior, because this framework does not only apply outward, it applies inward. If someone were to observe you over time, a across convenience and inconvenience, gain and loss, visibility and absence, what pattern would they see? Would your actions align with your stated values? Or would they track your incentives just as predictably as anyone else's? This is where the conversation becomes exact, because clarity is not just about reading others accurately. It is about becoming consistent enough that your own pattern does not fracture under pressure. Not perfect, but stable, so that when someone evaluates you, not in a moment, but across time, the signal you produce is coherent, reliable, difficult to misinterpret, because in the end, this is the only advantage that compounds. Not being impressive in isolated interactions, but being predictable in the ways that matter. Showing up when it is inconvenient. Maintaining position when it is not beneficial. Acting in alignment when there is no external reward. These are not dramatic actions. They are quiet, often unnoticed, but over time, they accumulate into something unmistakable. A pattern that does not need explanation. A pattern that does not rely on performance. A pattern that, once seen, becomes the only thing that matters. Chapter 12, you cannot unsee this, and that is exactly the point. Once you see it, the room changes, not physically. Nothing visible shifts. Conversations sound the same. People behave the same, but your perception splits. There is what is being said, and there is what is being calculated. And from this point forward, both layers run at the same time. You will hear agreement, and notice the timing behind it. You will see warmth, and register the conditions under which it appears. You will feel connection, and quietly question what sustains it when conditions change. This is not overthinking. This is pattern recognition, waking up. Most people live inside the surface layer because it is simpler. It allows interactions to feel clean, direct, uncomplicated. You say something, they respond. You show up, they react. Meaning feels immediate. But once you understand how quickly people classify, rank, and adjust, that simplicity dissolves. Not into confusion, into clarity. Because now you are no longer taking signals at face value. You are placing them in context. You begin to notice how fast the initial sorting happens, how little data it requires, how confidently it is executed. Before you have explained yourself, before you have demonstrated anything substantial, a version of you has already been accepted, rejected, or set aside. And everything that follows is influenced by that first placement. You also begin to see how consistent the adjustments are. The shift in tone when someone perceives value. The reduction in effort when they do not. The subtle tension when they feel challenged. The ease when they feel secure. None of it random. All of it structured. And here is where most people take a wrong turn. They assume that seeing this clearly should make them distrust everyone. That awareness should collapse connection. That once you recognize the calculation, authenticity disappears. That conclusion is understandable, but it is incomplete because recognizing structure does not eliminate meaning. It refines it. Cynicism says, nothing is real. Clarity says, not everything is equal. There are interactions that are purely functional, efficient, transactional, limited to immediate exchange. There are interactions that are adaptive, shifting based on context, responsive to incentives, consistent only within certain conditions. And then there are interactions that hold under pressure, not perfectly, but reliably, where behavior remains aligned even when the immediate calculation would suggest otherwise. Those are not obvious in the beginning. They do not announce themselves. They reveal themselves slowly, through consistency, through presence when it is inconvenient, through alignment when it is costly, through decisions that do not optimize for immediate gain. And without clarity, you cannot distinguish them. Everything feels the same. Everything is interpreted through the intensity of the moment. With clarity, the field separates. You stop confusing attention with investment. You stop confusing agreement with alignment. You stop confusing proximity with loyalty. And instead, you start weighting what actually persists. This does something subtle but important. It stabilizes you, because you are no longer dependent on interpreting every interaction perfectly. You are no longer trying to decode intention in real time, a task that is inherently unreliable. You shift to observing outcomes across time. You let patterns answer questions that single moments cannot. And because of that, your reactions become measured. You do not overcommit based on early signals. You do not withdraw based on isolated inconsistencies. You watch. You allow the structure to reveal itself. At the same time, your awareness of how you are being perceived sharpens. You understand that before you speak, before you explain, before you prove anything, a version of you is already operating in the minds of others, and that version is influencing how your words are received. This is not unfair. It is simply how perception works. The sequence is fixed. Perception first, evidence second. So you become more precise in how you enter spaces. Not artificial, not exaggerated, but intentional. You understand that small signals, posture, pace, presence, timing, are not superficial details. They are inputs into a system that makes rapid decisions. And those decisions shape the environment you are about to operate in. At the same time, something else emerges, a certain restraint. You stop needing every interaction to be genuine in the idealized sense. You accept that performance is part of the system, that people adjust, filter, and manage themselves continuously, not because they are deceptive, but because coordination requires it. And once you accept that, you stop reacting emotionally to normal variation. You expect it. You account for it. You focus on what is stable underneath. This is where clarity becomes functional, not a lens for judgment, a tool for navigation. You move through environments with a different calibration, less reactive, more observant, less attached to immediate impressions, more anchored in accumulated evidence. And with that, something quiet shifts in your behavior. You become harder to misread, not because you are controlling every signal, but because your internal alignment reduces inconsistency. You are not performing one version of yourself in one context and another version in the next. You are operating from a stable base, and over time, that stability becomes visible, not instantly, but inevitably, because while perception is fast, correction takes longer, and consistency is what drives correction. So yes, once you see this, you cannot go back. You cannot return to taking interactions at face value alone. You cannot ignore the underlying structure, but that is not a loss. It is precision. You are no longer moving through social environments blind to the forces shaping them. You are seeing the system as it operates. And that does not remove uncertainty, but it removes illusion. And in a space where most people are reacting to what they hope is true, you are responding to what is actually happening with a level of awareness that changes how every room meets you and how you choose to meet it. Chapter 1. The first move was not telling you there was a game. Nobody announced the rules. No one gathered you in a room and explained that life operates inside systems designed long before you arrived. You were simply placed inside them. School, work, culture, expectations. Each one presenting itself as normal, natural, inevitable. By the time most people begin questioning anything, they're already deep inside a structure they never realized existed. That absence of explanation is not a small detail. It is the first move. Think about it carefully. If a game begins and one group understands the rules while another group believes there are no rules at all, the outcome is already tilted. One side studies a board. The other side moves randomly, interpreting outcomes as luck, talent, or coincidence. Most people spend years trying to understand why certain patterns keep repeating in their lives. Opportunities appear unevenly distributed. Certain individuals seem to navigate institutions effortlessly, while others struggle despite equal effort. Ideas that challenge existing systems rarely gain traction, while ideas that reinforce the system spread quickly and widely. At first glance, it all looks chaotic, random, personal. But once you step back, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. What if the outcomes you see around you are not accidents, but the natural results of a system functioning exactly as it was designed to function? This was the uncomfortable insight that shaped the thinking of Niccolò Machiavelli. Writing in a turbulent political world where power shifted constantly, he studied rulers, institutions, and human behavior with an unusual level of honesty. What he noticed was not just a visible struggle for power, but the deeper structures that quietly organized it. The most effective systems, he observed, rarely look like systems at all. They look like ordinary life. They look like traditions everyone accepts without questioning. They look like economic arrangements people assume are permanent. They look like cultural narratives that define what success means and how it should be pursued. When something blends perfectly into daily experience, it stops feeling designed. It feels inevitable. And inevitability is powerful, because when people believe the environment around them simply is the way things are, they stop searching for the mechanisms behind it. Effort shifts inward. Individuals blame themselves for outcomes that are partly shaped by structures they cannot yet see. Someone loses an opportunity and assumes they lacked ability. Someone else rises quickly and believes it was purely merit. Both interpretations feel personal. Both feel logical. Yet both ignore the invisible architecture surrounding the situation. This is how large systems maintain stability without constant enforcement. They do not need to instruct every individual directly. They simply shape the conditions under which decisions are made. Imagine a chessboard where most of the pieces believe they are moving freely. They choose directions, make sacrifices, take risks. But the board itself defines what movements are possible. The boundaries, the rules, the positions, all of it quietly constrains a field of action. The pieces experience choice. The player experiences strategy. Once you begin to see life through that lens, familiar experiences start to look different. You may remember moments when a door seemed mysteriously closed despite your qualifications, or situations where someone with less apparent skill advanced quickly because they understood the unwritten rules of a particular environment. At the time, it might have felt unfair or confusing, but confusion often signals something deeper, a rule you were never shown. The absence of visible rules does not mean the game does not exist. It means the game is operating at a level most people were never encouraged to examine. That is why the first realization can feel slightly unsettling. When someone begins to recognize patterns behind everyday outcomes, it challenges a comforting assumption, the belief that everything happening around us is purely spontaneous. The truth is more complex. Human societies build systems to organize behavior, distribute resources, and maintain stability. Over time, those systems grow sophisticated. Incentives reward certain behaviors. Disincentives quietly discourage others. Narratives emerge that justify the arrangement. Eventually, the structure becomes so familiar that questioning it feels strange, even unnecessary. But structures do not disappear simply because they become familiar. They continue shaping outcomes whether we notice them or not. This is where awareness begins to matter. The moment someone realizes that systems exist behind appearances, a subtle shift occurs. Events stop looking entirely random. Patterns start emerging. Decisions made by institutions, organizations, and individuals begin to fit into larger frameworks of cause and effect. This does not mean every outcome is controlled or predetermined. It means outcomes occur within boundaries created by incentives, expectations, and historical momentum. Understanding those boundaries changes how you interpret the world. Instead of asking only personal questions, why did this happen to me? A different set of questions emerges. What conditions made this outcome likely? Who benefits when things unfold this way? What incentives encourage this pattern to continue? These questions do something powerful. They move your attention from isolated events to the structures surrounding them. And once attention shifts to structures, the sense of randomness begins to fade. Patterns appear in politics, in workplaces, in cultural trends, even in everyday social interactions. The same forces that guide large institutions often echo in smaller environments. Families, teams, communities. Some individuals notice these patterns instinctively. Others encounter them slowly through experience. But once the possibility enters your mind, the idea that invisible frameworks guide visible events, the world starts looking more organized than it first appeared. This realization does not make life cynical. It makes it clearer. Clarity reveals that success and failure rarely emerge from a single factor. Talent matters. Effort matters. Timing matters. But the surrounding system also matters, sometimes more than people realize. That understanding was the foundation of Machiavelli's analysis, not because he believed power belonged only to rulers, but because he believed anyone serious about navigating life needed to see the board they were standing on. And that brings us back to the beginning. The first move was never announced. No one formally explained that life unfolds inside layered systems shaped by history, incentives, and human psychology. People simply entered the world and started playing without realizing there was a board beneath their feet. But once someone recognizes that the board exists, something changes. Confusion gives way to observation. Observation leads to understanding. And understanding quietly reshapes every move that follows. The game was already in motion long before you noticed it. Chapter 2. The game does not require your awareness to operate on you. There is a moment most people experience at some point in life when something feels slightly off. You work hard, follow the expected path, do everything that was supposed to lead somewhere meaningful, and yet the outcomes don't always match the effort. Doors open for some people in ways that seem almost effortless. For others, progress feels like pushing against invisible resistance. At first, it's easy to interpret these differences as luck, personality, or timing. Those explanations feel comfortable because they keep the world simple. But as hinted earlier in Script G, something deeper is operating beneath those surface explanations. The game does not require your awareness to function. This is the first principle that changes how you see everything else. A chess piece does not understand strategy. It doesn't analyze the board or consider the intentions of the player moving it. The piece simply moves according to the rules built into the structure of the game. Its lack of understanding doesn't stop the match from unfolding. The board continues to evolve, positions shift, and outcomes emerge regardless of whether the pieces comprehend what is happening. Human systems work in a surprisingly similar way. Most people believe awareness is necessary for influence. They assume that if they don't see a system clearly, the system cannot meaningfully shape their lives. But structures do not require your participation to affect you. They only require that you exist inside them. Consider how environments shape behavior without ever announcing their presence. A workplace quietly rewards certain personalities and discourages others. A culture defines success in ways that guide ambition. Economic conditions steer decisions about education, career paths, and relationships long before anyone consciously analyzes the forces at work. None of these mechanisms need to explain themselves in order to influence choices. They simply create conditions. And once conditions exist, behavior begins to adapt around them. This is the subtle genius of invisible systems. They rarely appear as deliberate designs. Instead, they present themselves as ordinary life. Traditions, expectations, routines, institutional rules, All of it blends together until it feels natural. The more familiar something becomes, the less likely people are to question it. When an environment feels normal, the mind stops searching for the architecture behind it. That psychological tendency is not accidental. Human beings are built for efficiency. We rely on assumptions to navigate complex environments quickly. If every decision required questioning the entire system surrounding it, daily life will become exhausting. So the brain creates shortcuts. It accepts certain structures as permanent and focuses attention on immediate tasks. This efficiency works well for survival, but it also means large systems can operate quietly in the background. The Renaissance political thinker Niccolò Machiavelli observed this pattern long before modern psychology gave a name. While studying power and governance, he noticed that people rarely challenge the systems that organize their lives when those systems keep them occupied with immediate necessities. When survival becomes a central focus, earning income, managing responsibilities, responding to daily pressures, there is very little mental space left for examining the larger structures shaping those pressures in first place. In other words, the system does not need to hide aggressively. It only needs to keep people busy. Think about how most days unfold. You wake up to obligations that already exist. Schedules, bills, social expectations, professional responsibilities. Each one demands attention right now. By the time evening arrives, energy is limited and reflection becomes optional. This constant engagement with immediate concerns creates a narrow field of vision. Inside that field, life feels personal and individual. Success appears to belong entirely to those who achieve it. Failure feels like a personal flaw. Yet beyond that narrow focus lies a network of incentives and constraints quietly guiding the probabilities of both. Once you begin noticing those incentives, the environment starts revealing itself. Certain behaviors consistently produce rewards. Others trigger subtle resistance. Institutions favor particular ways of thinking. Cultural narratives elevate some ambitions while dismissing others. None of these patterns require central authority, directing them moment by moment. They emerge from structures built over time, structures that continue operating long after their creators are gone. This is why invisibility is so effective. A visible system invites scrutiny. An invisible one becomes part of reality itself. If something feels as permanent as gravity, most people will never ask to design the rules surrounding it. They simply learn to navigate within its limits. Over time, those limits start to feel like the natural boundaries of life. But recognizing that the boundaries exist is the beginning of a different relationship with them. Awareness does not immediately change the system. It does not suddenly remove constraints or transform circumstances overnight. What awareness does change is perspective. Events that once felt random begin to reveal patterns. Decisions made by institutions or influential individuals start to make sense when viewed through the lens of incentives rather than appearances. You begin to notice that outcomes rarely emerge from isolated moments. They emerge from environments. And environments are always shaping behavior, whether we see them or not. This insight can feel unsettling at first because it challenges a deeply comforting assumption, the belief that we are always acting inside a neutral landscape. But the reality revealed through observation is far more interesting. Human systems are dynamic fields of influence. They reward certain strategies. They discourage others. They amplify particular voices, while quietly reducing the reach of competing ideas. These patterns continue operating whether individuals recognize them or remain completely unaware. That is a quiet power of the game described throughout Script G. It does not require your belief. It does not require your understanding. It does not even require your attention. It simply continues unfolding to the structure surrounding you, shaping choices, guiding opportunities, and influencing outcomes in ways that most people only begin to notice much later, if they notice them at all. Chapter 3. How the game was designed to stay invisible. If you tell someone their life is being shaped by a hidden system, their first reaction is usually skepticism. The mind jumps immediately to dramatic images, secret meetings, shadowy figures, some central authority pulling strings behind the scenes. But that image is misleading, and understanding why is essential. The system described throughout Script G does not operate like a conspiracy. Conspiracies require constant coordination. They require secrecy, discipline, and ongoing control over countless individuals. History shows that such arrangements rarely survive for long. People talk, plans unravel, power shifts. A system that depends entirely on secrecy eventually collapses under its own complexity. The game that actually shapes human societies works differently. It is quieter, more stable, far more sophisticated. Instead of relying on direct control, it relies on structure. Imagine an architect designing a building. Once the walls are placed, once the doors and hallways are arranged, people inside that building will move in predictable ways. They will follow the paths available to them. They will use the entrances that exist and ignore the spaces that are difficult to reach. The architect does not need to stand inside the building telling everyone where to walk. The design itself quietly guides behavior. Human systems operate on the same principle. The most powerful forms of influence rarely appear as commands. They appear as environments, systems of incentives and consequences that gently push behavior in certain directions while discouraging others. Over time, those patterns become so familiar that people mistake them for natural reality rather than deliberate design. This is how the game stays invisible. When outcomes emerge from structures instead of direct orders, the structures disappear from attention. People see only the results. Promotions, opportunities, cultural trends, economic pressures. The mechanisms behind those outcomes remain hidden in plain sight. This insight was central to the thinking of Niccolò Machiavelli. While studying the rise and fall of governments during the Renaissance, he noticed something striking. The rulers who maintained power the longest were rarely the ones who relied on brute force. Force attracts resistance. It creates enemies. It exposes the hand of the person using it. The rulers who endured understood something deeper. They shaped the environment. Instead of controlling every individual decision, they influenced the conditions under which decisions were made. Laws, institutions, cultural expectations, economic arrangements. Each one quietly guided behavior. People believed they were acting freely, yet their choices unfolded inside a structure that had already narrowed the range of possibilities. When the environment is designed carefully, control becomes unnecessary. Think about the systems surrounding everyday life today. Education channels young people towards certain paths while discouraging others. Corporate hierarchies reward particular personality traits and working styles. Media narratives elevate some ambitions while dismissing others as unrealistic or irresponsible. None of these mechanisms need to issue commands. They simply create patterns of reward and consequence. Over time, those patterns begin shaping identity itself. A person raised inside a particular environment learns what success looks like before they ever question whether that definition was constructed. They learn which risks feel acceptable and which feel dangerous. They absorb the invisible rules of the system long before they realize those rules exist. And once a rule feels normal, people start defending it. This is one of the most fascinating dynamics of invisible systems. The individuals most influenced by them often become their strongest protectors, not because they intend to maintain control for someone else, but because the structure has become part of their understanding of reality. Challenging it would require rethinking everything they assumed about how the world works. So the system continues operating, reinforced not only by institutions, but by ordinary participants who believe they are protecting stability, fairness, or common sense. This is why powerful structures rarely need constant intervention from those who benefit most from them. The environment does the work. Incentives guide behavior. Cultural narratives justify the arrangement. Social pressure discourages challenges that might expose deeper mechanisms. The result is a system that regulates itself. You see this pattern everywhere once you begin looking for it. Certain ideas spread rapidly through society because they align with existing incentives. Others disappear quietly because they threaten the structure those incentives support. No single authority needs to suppress them directly. The environment itself filters what survives. From the outside, everything appears spontaneous, but patterns repeat too consistently to be random. Careers follow predictable pathways. Industries protect their own interests. Cultural conversations move in cycles that reinforce the status quo more often than they challenge it. Each piece fits together like parts of a structure built slowly over decades. This does not mean every part of the system was designed by a single mind. Human societies evolve through countless decisions made by different individuals across generations. But certain people understand the mechanics of influence earlier than others. They recognize how environments shape behavior, and they build institutions accordingly. Once those institutions exist, the pattern continues. New participants enter the system and adapt to it without questioning the design. They learn the incentives. They follow the available paths. Some succeed, some struggle, but most remain unaware that the structure guiding their choices was built long before they arrived. That is the quiet brilliance of an invisible system. It does not feel like control. It feels like life. People wake up each morning responding to pressures that seem completely ordinary. Work responsibilities, financial realities, cultural expectations. Each decision feels personal and immediate. Yet behind those decisions sits an environment quietly shaping which options appear realistic and which feel impossible. The board is already arranged before most players even realize they are standing on it. And because the structure is patient, it rarely reveals itself all at once. Instead, operates slowly through incentives, habits, and assumptions that accumulate over time. By the time someone begins to question it, the patterns are already deeply embedded. That is why the game described in Script G is so difficult to recognize at first. Not because it is hidden behind secrecy, but because it is woven into the ordinary fabric of daily life. Chapter 4. Present Necessities, the most elegant mechanism of control. Imagine waking up tomorrow with no bills to pay, no deadlines pressing against your attention, no constant stream of responsibilities pulling your focus in every direction. Just space, silence, time to actually observe the structure of the life you're living. For most people, that scenario feels almost unrealistic, not because it's impossible in theory, but because the modern environment is built in a way that rarely allows it to happen. And that is where one of the most subtle mechanisms described throughout Script G begins to reveal itself. The system rarely controls people through obvious force. It controls them through urgency. Every day arrives with immediate needs already waiting. Work obligations, financial pressure, social expectations, a list of responsibilities that must be handled now, not later. Each demand pulls your attention toward the next problem that needs solving. And when your attention is constantly absorbed by the next necessity, something important disappears from view. Perspective. You stop asking how the structure around you came to exist in the first place. You stop examining the architecture of the system because you are too busy navigating its corridors. This is what the Renaissance thinker Niccolò Machiavelli observed with unusual clarity. While studying power, he noticed that the most stable systems rarely rely on constant enforcement. They rely on conditions that keep people occupied with survival, progress, and immediate concerns. When life demands your full attention in the present moment, reflection becomes a luxury. Consider how this plays out in ordinary routines. A person wakes up early, rushes to work, spends the day responding to tasks that feel urgent and unavoidable. When evening arrives, energy is low. The mind seeks relief, not analysis. Entertainment becomes the easiest way to reset before the next cycle begins. Day after day, the same rhythm repeats. There is nothing unusual about this pattern. In fact, it feels completely normal. Yet that sense of normality hides something remarkable. A life filled with constant necessities leaves very little room for examining the systems that generate those necessities. You focus on paying bills rather than questioning why certain economic structures determine how bills exist in the first place. You focus on meeting expectations rather than examining who defined those expectations and what purpose they serve. You focus on coping with pressure rather than analyzing the environment that continuously produces that pressure. None of this requires deception. No one needs to stand in front of you and say, "Don't ask questions." The structure simply ensures that you rarely have the time, energy, or distance required to ask them deeply. That is why this mechanism is so effective. Force creates resistance. Obvious manipulation creates suspicion. But necessity feels legitimate. It feels unavoidable. When people are busy solving immediate problems, they assume the environment creating those problems must simply be the natural shape of reality. And so the system continues operating quietly in the background. Think of it like navigating a maze. When you are inside a maze, every decision demands attention. Turn left, turn right, find the next opening. Your mind is focused entirely on movement within the structure. From that perspective, the maze feels endless and confusing. But someone standing above it sees something completely different. From above, the entire structure becomes visible. The walls reveal their pattern. Dead ends make sense. Paths that once felt random suddenly form a design. The difference between those two perspectives is not intelligence. It is position. Most people live their lives inside the maze of daily necessity. They move quickly from one demand to the next, responding to conditions as they appear. Their decisions feel personal and immediate, even though the environment guiding those decisions was shaped long before they arrived. And because everyone around them is navigating the same maze, the structure itself remains unquestioned. The pattern becomes culture. People begin measuring their worth by how effectively they respond to necessity. Productivity becomes a virtue. Busyness becomes a signal of importance. Rest, reflection, and distance from the system start to feel almost irresponsible. Over time, the environment reinforces itself. The more energy people invest in navigating daily pressures, the less likely they are to step back and examine the forces creating those pressures. The system doesn't need to hide its design aggressively. It simply fills life with enough activity to keep the design out of view. But here is where something interesting happens. The moment someone begins noticing the pattern, even slightly, their relationship to the system begins to change. They may still participate in the same routines. They may still meet the same responsibilities. But the automatic acceptance of those routines starts to fade. Instead of seeing daily pressures as isolated events, they begin recognizing them as pieces of a larger structure. They start asking different questions. Why do certain pressures repeat across so many lives? Why do particular institutions produce the same patterns generation after generation? Why do some environments reward endless urgency while discouraging reflection? These questions do not instantly remove necessity from life. Bills still exist. Responsibilities still demand attention. But awareness introduces a small but powerful shift. It separates you from the illusion that necessity is the entire story. You begin to notice that the system thrives when attention stays locked on the next urgent demand. The moment attention expands beyond that narrow focus, something changes. The maze is still there, but its shape becomes slightly clearer. And once a structure becomes visible, even partially, it stops feeling inevitable. This realization doesn't require rebellion or dramatic action. It begins with observation, a quiet recognition that constant busyness is not simply the natural texture of a meaningful life. Sometimes it is the most efficient way to prevent a certain kind of thinking, the kind of thinking that steps back from the corridor and begins studying the architecture of the maze itself. Chapter 5, the 4 positions. Where are you on the board right now? Let's begin with a question that most people never stop to ask. If life is a game of structures, incentives, and invisible rules, where exactly are you standing on the board? Not in terms of status, not in terms of wealth or education. Those things can be misleading. The real distinction lies in how clearly a person sees the system they're living inside and what they do with that awareness. When you observe the patterns of power closely enough, for positions begin to emerge. These positions are not permanent identities. They are states of awareness and behavior. People move between them over time, sometimes without even realizing it. Understanding them is the first step toward understanding your own relationship with the game. The first position is the unconscious piece. This is where the majority of people exist, and not because they lack intelligence or ambition. Quite the opposite. Many unconscious pieces are highly capable individuals who have learned how to operate effectively within the environment around them. They study the rules they are given. They work hard. They pursue advancement. They build families, careers, and reputations. Their life feels like a sequence of personal choices and individual outcomes. Success appears to be the result of effort. Failure appears to be the result of insufficient effort. The system itself remains invisible. This invisibility is what makes the position so stable. When someone believes the rules of their environment are simply the natural order of the world, they do not question them. In fact, they often defend them. They pass those rules on to others as advice, wisdom, and life lessons. Work hard. Follow the path. Do what works. None of these ideas are necessarily wrong, but they operate entirely inside the system's boundaries. The unconscious piece becomes deeply skilled at playing by the rules while never asking who wrote those rules or why they exist. In this way, the system quietly reproduces itself through the people living inside it. Then something shifts for a smaller group of individuals. They begin to notice patterns. This is the second position, the conscious piece. A conscious piece can sense that something larger than individual effort is shaping outcomes. They notice recurring structures inside institutions. They observe that certain behaviors are rewarded again and again, while other forms of thinking quietly disappear from the environment. At first, this awareness can feel empowering, but it often becomes uncomfortable very quickly, because seeing the system does not automatically grant the ability to navigate effectively. A conscious piece understands that the board exists, but they have not yet learned how to move across it strategically. This creates a strange psychological tension. Part of them wants to challenge the structure. Another part feels trapped inside it. They oscillate between clarity and frustration, moments when the architecture of power feels obvious, followed by moments when navigating everyday life requires temporarily ignoring that clarity. It is an uneasy place to stand. The Renaissance political thinker Niccolò Machiavelli believed awareness, without strategy, was a fragile position. Seeing the game matters, but it does not change outcomes unless it is paired with the ability to act deliberately within the environment, which leads us to the third position, the unconscious player. This individual is often mistaken for someone who simply got lucky. Their career advances smoothly. Their influence grows. They seem to move through institutions with unusual ease. But what appears effortless is usually instinct. An unconscious player has absorbed the rules of the system so thoroughly that they operate by them automatically. They recognize opportunity without needing to analyze it. They sense shifts in social dynamics before others notice them. They make decisions that place them in advantageous positions again and again. If you ask them to explain exactly how they do it, many would struggle. They simply know. This instinctive fluency allows them to win inside the system consistently. Yet it also carries a hidden vulnerability. Because when someone succeeds through intuition alone, they may not fully understand the mechanics behind their success. And systems do not stay static forever. Institutions evolve. Power shifts. Cultural values transform. When the environment changes dramatically, instinct alone may not be enough. The unconscious player who once navigated the system effortlessly can suddenly find themselves disoriented. The rules they mastered have quietly moved. Which brings us to the final position, the conscious player. This is the rarest place on the board. A conscious player sees the structure as shaping outcomes, but unlike the conscious piece, they do not remain stuck in observation. They study the incentives built into institutions. They recognize how influence travels through networks. They analyze the patterns that determine which ideas rise and which disappear, and then they act accordingly. A conscious player does not waste energy pretending the system does not exist. They also do not waste energy resenting it endlessly. Instead, they treat it as an environment to be understood. They pay attention to leverage. They notice timing. They recognize that power rarely moves in straight lines. It flows through relationships, perception, and positioning. Their advantage is not simply awareness. It is awareness combined with intention. Every move becomes more deliberate. Decisions are made with a wider perspective. Situations that once looked random begin revealing patterns. What once felt like chaos begins to look like structure. And once a person begins seeing the board this way, a quiet but profound shift occurs. They stop asking whether the game exists. They begin asking something far more important. Where exactly am I standing on the board right now? Chapter 6, The Unconscious Piece. Why intelligence alone does not set you free. There is a dangerous assumption many intelligent people carry without realizing it. They believe that intelligence automatically protects them from manipulation, from structural influence, from systems quietly shaping their lives. It does not. In fact, intelligence can make someone more deeply embedded inside a system rather than less. Because intelligence, when directed only towards solving problems within an environment, becomes an instrument that strengthens the environment itself. This is a position known as the unconscious piece. It is important to understand this position carefully, because it is not defined by weakness. It is not defined by ignorance in the ordinary sense. Some of the most capable individuals in society occupy this position. Doctors, executives, scholars, professionals who have mastered extremely complex fields. Their intelligence is real. Their discipline is real. Their achievements are real. And yet the system that shaped those achievements remains almost entirely invisible to them. Why? Because their intelligence has been trained to operate inside the rules rather than question the rules. From an early age, most people are rewarded for learning how the environment works and adapting to efficiently. Schools reward those who follow structured paths. Institutions reward those who perform well within defined expectations. Careers reward those who align their behavior with the incentives of the organization they serve. None of these things are inherently malicious. They are simply how systems stabilize themselves. But over time, something subtle happens. A person becomes highly skilled at navigating the environment exactly as it exists. They learn which behaviors lead to approval, which strategies produce advancement, which risks are safe, and which risks quietly end careers. Eventually, they succeed. And success has a powerful psychological effect. When the structure you are living inside produces rewards for you, it becomes very difficult to imagine that the structure itself might deserve examination. Success inside a system feels like proof that the system is fair. But fairness and functionality are not the same thing. A system can function exactly as designed, while still shaping outcomes in ways most people never notice. And the unconscious piece rarely investigates that possibility, because their experience within the system feels validating. They worked hard. They made the right decisions. They earned their position. From their perspective, the environment rewarded merit. So when someone else struggles or questions the structure itself, the unconscious piece often interprets that questioning as misunderstanding or personal failure. This is where the system gains one of its most powerful defenders. Not a ruler, not an architect, a participant, someone who believes deeply in the rules, because those rules produce their success. The Renaissance political thinker Niccolò Machiavelli understood that systems remain stable not simply because they are enforced, but because people internalize them. Once individuals begin protecting the structure voluntarily, power becomes far easier to maintain. The unconscious piece performs its role without intending to. They repeat the narratives that supported their own progress. They encourage others to follow the same path. They explain success using the same framework that worked for them. Work harder, stay disciplined, play by the rules. Again, none of these ideas are inherently wrong. Hard work matters. Discipline matters. But when those principles are treated as the entire explanation for success, something important disappears from the conversation: the structure itself. Consider how often systems reward people who adapt to them, while quietly marginalizing those who question them. An employee who performs efficiently within an organization often advances faster than the one who spends time analyzing the organization's deeper incentives. Not because questioning lacks intelligence, but because questioning the system does not help the system maintain itself. Over time, this dynamic creates a powerful feedback loop. The individuals who succeed most visibly become living proof that the system works. Their achievements reinforce the belief that the rules are correct. Their voices become influential because their lives appear to validate the structure. And so the unconscious piece begins doing something remarkable. They become the boundary of the system. When someone starts noticing patterns of power or questioning the incentives behind institutions, the unconscious piece often responds immediately. They dismiss the idea. They label it pessimistic or unrealistic. They reassure others that the system simply rewards effort and discipline. They do this sincerely. From their perspective, the explanation is obvious, but sincerity does not equal accuracy. What they are defending is not necessarily truth, but familiarity. The structure they understand is the structure that gave their life coherence. Questioning it threatens more than just an idea. It threatens a narrative that explains their own success. This is why intelligence alone does not set someone free. A brilliant mind can solve thousands of problems within a system while never examining the system itself. In fact, the better someone becomes at succeeding within the rules, the less incentive they have to question them. The unconscious piece is therefore not trapped by lack of ability. They are anchored by satisfaction. And satisfaction, when it arrives from inside a structure, can be the most effective form of containment a system could ever design. Chapter 7. The Conscious Piece. Seeing the game without knowing how to play it. There is a moment in a person's life that feels almost impossible to reverse. It usually begins quietly, not with a dramatic revelation, not with a sudden transformation. Instead, something small interrupts the story you have always believed about how the world works. A pattern repeats one too many times. A conversation lingers longer than expected. A book, an observation, or a personal experience cracks the surface just enough for a different possibility to appear. And once you see it, you cannot fully return to the old perspective. You begin sensing structure where you once saw coincidence. Outcomes that used to feel random begin revealing patterns. Certain people consistently rise in influence. Certain ideas repeatedly dominate public attention. Certain behaviors are quietly rewarded across completely different institutions. At first, the realization feels energizing. It feels like waking up. But that feeling rarely lasts long. Because the moment awareness expands, another realization follows quickly behind it. Seeing the game is not the same as knowing how to play it. This is a position of the conscious piece. Unlike the unconscious piece, this person has begun to recognize the architecture shaping their environment. They notice the incentives that guide behavior. They observe how influence flows through relationships and perception rather than simply through effort or talent. Something larger than individual choice becomes visible, but visibility alone does not provide direction. In fact, it can create a strange psychological tension. The conscious piece now sees forces that others appear completely unaware of. They recognize patterns in institutions, careers, media, and social systems that once seemed perfectly ordinary, yet they still live inside those systems. They still have responsibilities, obligations, and practical realities to navigate. Awareness does not remove them from the environment. It simply removes the illusion that the environment is neutral. That shift creates discomfort. At times it creates anger. There are moments when the conscious piece feels an intense clarity about what they are observing. The structure seems obvious. The incentives feel transparent. It becomes easy to see how certain narratives dominate culture and why certain outcomes repeat across different places. Then reality intervenes. Bills still exist. Careers still require navigation. Social relationships still operate according to expectations that did not disappear simply because someone became more aware of them. The conscious piece therefore moves through life with a new form of friction. Part of them wants to confront the system. Another part recognizes that confrontation without strategy leads nowhere. They begin to feel caught between two worlds. The comfortable narrative most people still believe, and the more complicated reality they have started to perceive. This tension produces a familiar cycle. Moments of clarity lead to frustration. Frustration leads to emotional reaction. Emotional reaction eventually becomes exhausting. And exhaustion tempts the person to retreat temporarily back into the old story, the one where life is simply a series of personal choices and outcomes. But the mind rarely forgets what is already seen. The awareness returns. And each time it does, the discomfort becomes sharper. This is why the conscious piece often feels isolated. Not necessarily physically isolated, but psychologically separated from the environment around them. Conversations that once felt straightforward now feel incomplete. Advice that once sounded wise now sounds simplistic. They begin noticing how often people confuse participation in a system with understanding it. The Renaissance political thinker Niccolò Machiavelli studied this dynamic in the political world of his time. He observed that recognizing realities of power was only the first step in navigating it. Many individuals could see the forces shaping events around them, but far fewer developed the discipline required to act effectively within those forces. Awareness without strategy produced frustration. Strategy without awareness produced blindness. The conscious piece stands exactly in the middle of that divide. They have paid the psychological price of seeing the system more clearly than before, yet they have not fully developed the skills required to move through it deliberately. Their attention is often consumed by analyzing what is wrong, rather than studying how systems actually operate. An analysis without direction can drain enormous amounts of energy. The mind circles the same questions repeatedly. Why do certain people rise so predictably? Why do institutions resist change so stubbornly? Why do systems that appear flawed continue functioning year after year? These questions are important, but when they remain unanswered, they can trap the conscious piece in a loop of observation without progress. Anger becomes tempting because anger provides a sense of action. It feels like resistance. But anger alone rarely changes structures. It simply burns energy that could otherwise be used to study the environment more carefully. Resignation becomes tempting for the opposite reason. If the system appears too large or too complex to influence, withdrawing emotionally can feel like relief. Accept the structure. Focus on personal survival. Stop thinking about the broader patterns altogether. But resignation carries its own cost. It abandons a very awareness that made deeper understanding possible in the first place. The conscious peace, therefore, lives inside a difficult psychological space. They see enough to know that the world is more structured than it appears. Yet they have not fully translated that insight into a disciplined way of navigating those structures. This stage can last years. For some people, it lasts a lifetime. But something important happens during this period if the person resists both extremes, the chaos of anger and the comfort of resignation. Over time, the mind begins shifting its attention away from emotional reaction and toward careful observation. Instead of asking why the system exists, they begin asking how it functions. Instead of reacting to power, they begin studying it. They watch how influence actually moves through institutions. They notice which behaviors create leverage and which ones quietly reduce it. They begin recognizing that systems rarely change through confrontation alone. They change through positioning, timing, and understanding incentives more clearly than the people around you. This change in perspective is subtle, but it is the moment the conscious piece stops merely seeing the board and begins studying the moves being played on it. Chapter 8. The Conscious Player, the rarest and most powerful position. Let's begin with a difficult realization. No one escapes the game. Not the successful, not the rebellious, not the person who believes they have stepped outside the system entirely. Human societies generate structures the moment people begin organizing themselves. Incentives appear. Hierarchies form. Influence moves through networks of perception, trust, fear, loyalty, and ambition. The board exists whether you acknowledge it or not. The question, then, is not whether the game is real. The question is who learns to move within it consciously. That is where the rarest position appears. The conscious player. Most people misunderstand what this position looks like. Popular culture teaches us to associate power with visibility. Titles, authority, public recognition, dramatic displays of dominance. But the deepest form of power rarely announces itself that way. The conscious player often moves quietly, not because they lack ambition, but because they understand something fundamental about systems. The most effective influence usually operates through alignment rather than confrontation. Instead of constantly fighting the structure, they study it. They watch where incentives lead behavior. They observe how perception shapes opportunity. They begin to see patterns others overlook. The difference between a conscious player and everyone else is not intelligence alone. Many intelligent people remain trapped reacting to the system around them. The difference is orientation. A conscious player looks at the same environment but asks entirely different questions. Instead of asking why something feels unfair, they ask what incentives produce that outcome. Instead of asking who deserves influence, they ask how influence is actually accumulated. Instead of reacting emotionally to the existence of power structures, they examine how those structures function. This shift in perspective transforms the entire experience of navigating the world. A conscious player stops assuming that institutions operate primarily according to ideals. They recognize that systems behave according to incentives. If you want to understand any structure, a company, a political system, a cultural institution, you look first at what behaviors it rewards consistently. The reward structure reveals the real rules. Once those rules become visible, the environment starts making more sense. Decisions that once looked irrational begin to appear predictable. Outcomes that seem random reveal their logic. The conscious player studies these dynamics patiently, not with cynicism, but with clarity. The Renaissance political thinker Niccolò Machiavelli spent much of his life observing exactly this phenomenon. His work is often misunderstood as advice for ruthless rulers. In reality, he was documenting how power behaves in the real world, stripped of comforting illusions. What he understood was simple but unsettling. Power rarely belongs to the person who claims the highest moral ground. It belongs to the person who understands the environment well enough to move effectively within it. But the conscious player takes this insight one step further. They do not simply learn how to navigate structures for external gain. Titles, status, and influence may appear along the way, but those are not the foundation of their power. The foundation is internal sovereignty. Most people spend their lives reacting to forces they barely recognize. Expectations from family, cultural narratives about success, institutional pressures, economic anxieties, social approval. These forces push people into predictable paths long before they pause to ask whether those paths reflect what they actually want. The conscious player interrupts that process. They recognize the system's default destinations, the career trajectories, the social hierarchies, the definitions of success that appear everywhere around them. But recognition gives them distance. Distance creates choice. Instead of drifting toward the outcomes a structure naturally produces, they begin selecting their direction deliberately. Some may pursue influence inside institutions. Others may position themselves at the edges of systems where creativity and independence are easier to maintain. The key difference is intentionality. They are no longer moving blindly. This shift changes how decisions are made. A conscious player evaluates opportunities differently. They ask whether a path increases leverage or quietly reduces it. They examine how alliances shape outcomes. They recognize that reputation, perception, and timing can sometimes outweigh raw effort. None of this requires manipulation or cruelty. In fact, conscious players often avoid unnecessary conflict because they understand that energy is a limited resource. Instead of reacting to every challenge, they choose their battles carefully. They position themselves where their actions produce disproportionate results. Over time, this approach compounds. Small advantages accumulate. Relationships deepen strategically. The person becomes increasingly difficult to trap inside the narrow roles the system assigns by default. From the outside, their path can appear unusual. They may refuse opportunities that look prestigious but restrict their autonomy. They may pursue directions others initially misunderstand. Yet their choices follow a consistent internal logic. They know what they're playing for. This clarity is the real power of the conscious player. It is not about controlling everyone else on the board. It is about refusing to let unseen forces determine the direction of your own movement. Once a person reaches this stage, something irreversible happens. They stop measuring success purely through the system's existing scorecards. Status, money, recognition. These can still matter, but they no longer define the entire game. They become tools rather than destinations. The conscious player understands that every structure offers both opportunities and limitations. Instead of pretending those limitations do not exist, they work around them. Instead of rejecting systems entirely, they learn where influence actually resides within them. That understanding creates freedom of movement, not the fantasy of escaping the game altogether, but something far more practical. The ability to move through the environment with open eyes, the ability to recognize pressure without being unconsciously directed by it, and most importantly, the ability to choose deliberately, calmly, and without apology what your life is actually oriented toward. Chapter 9. Whose side are you on? The question that changes everything. Here is the moment where everything becomes personal. Up to this point, the conversation has been about systems, structures, positions on the board, and the invisible patterns that shape outcomes in human societies. It has been analytical, observational, almost clinical in the way it examines how the game operates. But eventually, every analysis reaches a point where observation alone is no longer enough, a decision appears. And a decision is far more intimate than most people expect. Whose side are you on? At first hearing, the question can sound dramatic, even moralistic. People assume it is asking whether someone stands with the powerful or the powerless, the virtuous or the corrupt, the enlightened or the unaware. But that is not the real question. The real question is much quieter. Are you on the side of your own life? Or are you on the side of the version of your life that the surrounding system has been producing for you while you were too busy surviving inside it to notice? That distinction changes everything. Because systems are not neutral environments. They are engines. They produce predictable outcomes when people move through them without examining their design. Careers take familiar shapes. Social hierarchies stabilize. Cultural narratives guide people toward the same definitions of success over and over again. None of this requires direct control over individuals. All it requires is the presence of incentives. When a structure rewards certain behaviors consistently, people begin organizing their lives around those rewards. They pursue what the system recognizes as valuable. They measure themselves according to the metrics the environment provides. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, their sense of identity begins to merge with the role they play inside the structure. They become the employee, the professional, the consumer, the citizen defined by expectations that existed long before they arrived. For many people, this happens so gradually that it never feels like a choice. It feels like life unfolding. But once a person becomes aware of the board, once they begin seeing how narratives, incentives, and institutions guide behavior, something changes. The process that once felt automatic now becomes visible. And visibility creates a new responsibility, because now a different question appears. Do you continue allowing the system to determine the direction of your life by default? Or do you begin making decisions with the awareness that those systems exist? This is the moment when neutrality disappears. You are either aligning with the momentum of the structure, or you are beginning to orient yourself towards something more deliberate. There's a side of the game that benefits when people never examine these questions. It thrives on constant reaction. It prefers individuals who remain fully absorbed in consumption, competition, and comparison. People who measure their value through the metrics the system continuously broadcasts back to them. Income levels, social approval, titles, recognition. These measurements are not meaningless. They can reflect real achievement. But when they become the only scoreboard a person recognizes, they quietly determine the direction of that person's entire life. The individual begins chasing signals designed by the system rather than asking what they actually want their life to represent. That is how the game sustains itself, not through coercion, but through alignment. People adopt the goals the structure presents, pursue them with genuine effort, and rarely pause long enough to question whether those goals originated from their own values or from the architecture surrounding them. The Renaissance political thinker Niccolò Machiavelli spent much of his life studying the mechanics behind this dynamic. He was less interested in moralizing about power than in understanding how it actually behaves when human beings organize themselves into systems. His conclusions were uncomfortable because they stripped away comforting illusions. Power follows incentives. Institutions protect themselves. Structures reward the behaviors that keep them stable. But hidden within that clarity was a deeper implication. Once a person understands how the system operates, they are no longer required to move through it blindly. They can choose their orientation. Choosing your side does not mean rejecting every structure you inhabit. That would be impossible. Human life unfolds within networks of institutions and relationships. No one lives entirely outside them. What changes is your relationship to those structures. Instead of assuming they define you, you begin treating them as environments to navigate. You recognize the pressures they create without mistaking those pressures for destiny. You see the incentives without surrendering your identity to them. This is the beginning of sovereignty. Not sovereignty over the world, which is a fantasy, but sovereignty over your own direction within it. The difference may sound subtle, but it changes the psychology of every decision that follows. When someone is unconsciously aligned with the system, life feels like something happening to them. Opportunities appear or disappear. Circumstances shift. External events determine the next move. When someone begins aligning with their own life instead, the relationship to causality transforms. They start asking different questions. Why did that outcome occur? What incentives were operating beneath the surface? Which forces shape the environment I am moving through right now? Understanding these patterns does not grant instant power. It does not eliminate obstacles or guarantee success, but it introduces something far more valuable: agency. The person is no longer drifting through events without context. They are observing, interpreting, and responding with increasing precision. The board becomes clearer. The moves being played around them become easier to anticipate, and slowly, their own moves become more intentional. This is a shift that quietly separates people who feel trapped by circumstances from those who gradually begin shaping them. Not because they control everything, but because they understand enough of the system to influence what happens next. Which brings us back to the question that started this chapter. Whose side are you on? The side that allows the game to write your life in the background while you focus on surviving each day? Or the side that studies the structure carefully, accepts that the game exists, and begins moving through it with the quiet determination of someone who has decided that their life will not be lived accidentally? Chapter 10. Reading Fortuna, Machiavelli's blueprint for navigating forces beyond your control. There is a moment every strategist eventually confronts. It arrives the first time you realize that effort alone does not determine outcomes. Two people can work with equal discipline, equal intelligence, equal persistence, and yet their results diverge dramatically. One finds momentum, the other meets resistance at every step. Opportunities appear unexpectedly for one, while the other struggles against circumstances that never seem to align. At first, this feels unfair. Later, it begins to feel mysterious. Eventually, if a person studies the patterns long enough, they discover something else entirely. It is neither unfair nor mysterious. It is environmental. Long before modern strategy language existed, the Florentine political thinker Niccolo Machiavelli described this phenomenon using a single word: fortuna. Fortuna referred to the unpredictable forces shaping human events. The shifting conditions, the timing of opportunities, the cultural winds, the economic tides, the unpredictable intersections of chance and circumstance that influence outcomes long before an individual enters the picture. Most people interpret these forces as fate. When fortune turns against them, they believe life is simply happening to them. When circumstances suddenly favor them, they describe it as luck. The environment becomes something random, chaotic, impossible to anticipate. But the strategist approaches fortuna differently. Not as fate, as weather. No sailor believes they control the ocean. No pilot assumes they can command the wind. Yet experienced navigators rarely treat the environment as pure chaos. They study patterns. They observe pressure systems, currents, seasonal rhythms, historical behavior. Over time, the environment begins to reveal tendencies. Storms rarely appear without warning signs. Favorable currents often follow recognizable routes. Winds shift according to conditions that can be studied long before a voyage begins. The navigator still cannot control the weather, but they can read it, and reading it changes everything. The conscious player treats life's forces the same way. Instead of assuming that outcomes are determined purely by effort or purely by luck, they examine the conditions surrounding every opportunity. They study timing. They pay attention to cultural movements, institutional incentives, technological shifts, social mood. They notice that certain ideas gain traction only when the environment is ready for them. Certain careers accelerate only when industries reach specific moments of transformation. Certain alliances become powerful because the surrounding context suddenly makes them valuable. None of these developments appear random once you begin observing them closely. They are currents, and like all currents, they move with direction and momentum. The mistake most people make is believing that determination alone can overcome any environment. They imagine that sufficient willpower can force success even when conditions are working against them. Sometimes that belief produces heroic effort. More often it produces exhaustion, because fighting against strong currents requires enormous energy while producing very little movement. The conscious player learns a different approach. Instead of forcing movement constantly, they watch first. They observe which forces are strengthening and which are fading. They identify moments when the environment begins shifting in subtle but meaningful ways. And when the conditions align, they move quickly. This patience is often misunderstood. From the outside, it can look like hesitation or inactivity, but in reality, it is preparation. The person is gathering information, refining their understanding of the terrain, waiting for the moment when effort and environment begin working in the same direction. When that moment arrives, their actions appear decisive, almost effortless. But the effort was never absent. It was simply directed toward understanding the landscape before attempting to move across it. This approach transforms how a person experiences uncertainty. Instead of reacting emotionally to every unexpected development, they begin treating events as information. A failed opportunity becomes data about timing. A sudden shift in circumstances becomes a signal about larger forces in motion. Over time, the environment becomes more legible. Patterns emerge where others see chaos. Certain industries accelerate in predictable cycles. Cultural values evolve through recognizable stages. Institutions respond to pressures in ways that repeat across decades. None of this eliminates uncertainty, but it reduces blindness. The person navigating with this awareness is rarely caught completely off guard because they have been paying attention to the early signals most people ignore. Developing this capacity requires discipline. First, it requires observation without distortion. Many people interpret events through the lens of what they hope is happening or what they fear is happening. Both reactions cloud perception. Reading the environment accurately demands intellectual honesty, the willingness to see conditions exactly as they are rather than as you wish them to be. Second, it requires humility. Even experienced observers misread signals. Conditions change unexpectedly. Predictions fail. The conscious navigator treats mistakes not as personal failures, but as corrections to their map. Each misreading refines the ability to see the environment more clearly next time. Third, it requires patience. The modern world celebrates constant action. Movement feels productive even when it leads nowhere. But navigation is not about constant motion. It is about effective motion. Sometimes the most strategic move is waiting until conditions shift. That patience allows the conscious player to conserve energy for the moments that actually matter. Over time, something remarkable happens. Life stops feeling like a series of random storms crashing into your plans. Instead, it begins to resemble a landscape, complex, unpredictable, but navigable. You start recognizing favorable currents earlier. You anticipate turbulence before it arrives. You begin positioning yourself where the environment amplifies your movement rather than resisting it. This does not mean the journey becomes easy. Weather still changes. Storms still appear. Circumstances still evolve beyond anyone's control. But the difference between drifting and navigating becomes unmistakable. One person moves through the environment, reacting to every gust of wind. The other studies the sky carefully enough to understand where the wind is likely to carry them next. Chapter 11: Strategic Patience, Strategic Relationships, and a Commitment to Reality. Most people lose the game before they even realize they were playing. Not because they are unintelligent, not because they lack ambition, and not because they were denied opportunity. They lose because they misunderstand the time scale. In the modern world, speed is celebrated as intelligence. Quick reactions, immediate results, constant movement. The person who moves fast appears decisive. The person who waits appears uncertain. But if you study how power actually accumulates over time, a different pattern emerges. The most effective players are rarely the fastest. They are the most patient. Centuries ago, the Florentine political thinker Niccolò Machiavelli wrote extensively about the collision between human initiative and external conditions, what he called virtù. The capacity to act with skill and decisiveness only becomes powerful when it meets the right moment in the environment, and those moments rarely arrive quickly. The systems shaping your life today were not built last year. Institutions take decades to form. Cultural expectations evolve across generations. The habits that guide human behavior were written into our psychology long before modern societies even existed. Yet, people expect transformation immediately. They expect their position in the game to shift in weeks, sometimes in days. When that shift does not appear, they assume something is wrong, either with themselves or with the effort they are making. But the experienced player understands something different. The slow phase is not the problem. The slow phase is the preparation. Strategic patience is not passive waiting. It is active positioning. It is the discipline of building capability long before the moment arrives when that capability becomes visible. It is a quiet accumulation of understanding while others are distracted by short-term outcomes. Look carefully at individuals who appear to suddenly succeed. The outside world sees the moment of recognition, the promotion, the breakthrough, the public victory. What it rarely sees is the decade of preparation that preceded it. Strategic patience allows a person to survive that invisible phase without losing direction. It prevents them from abandoning long-term positioning simply because short-term validation has not yet appeared. But patience alone is not enough. The second quality that separates the conscious player from everyone else on the board is the careful construction of strategic relationships. And this concept is widely misunderstood. When people hear the phrase strategic relationships, they often imagine manipulation, networking performed with cold calculation, people treated like tools to be used and discarded once their usefulness ends. That behavior exists, of course, but it is the behavior of someone who still misunderstands a game. True strategic relationships are built on mutual value. They emerge when individuals recognize that certain people perceive the environment more clearly than others, and that proximity to those minds accelerates understanding. Human thinking is rarely as independent as we believe. Our ideas are shaped by the conversations we have, the perspectives we encounter, the assumptions reinforced by the people around us. Spend enough time in an environment where no one studies the structure of the game, and eventually the structure disappears from your awareness as well. Surround yourself with people who observe patterns carefully, and the opposite occurs. Your thinking sharpens. Your interpretations become more precise. You begin seeing possibilities that never appeared before because someone else has already learned to recognize them. This is why the composition of a person's inner circle reveals so much about their trajectory. The individuals you think with will inevitably shape the moves you make. Their standards influence your standards. Their assumptions become the background against which your own decisions are evaluated. Choose poorly, and your perception narrows. Choose wisely, and your perception expands. Strategic relationships are not about exploiting people. They are about building environments where clear thinking becomes a norm. The third quality, the one supporting both patience and relationships, is far more difficult than it sounds. It is a commitment to reality. Most people believe they already possess this quality. They assume they see the world as it is. But human psychology has a powerful preference for comfortable interpretations. We instinctively gravitate toward explanations that protect our identity, confirm our beliefs, and preserve our sense of stability. Reality often does the opposite. It exposes inconvenient truths. It reveals that incentives shape behavior more than ideals. It shows that institutions protect themselves before they protect individuals. It demonstrates that power follows patterns most societies prefer not to discuss openly. Seeing these patterns clearly can be uncomfortable. Sometimes it invites criticism. The person who observes systems honestly is occasionally described as cynical or pessimistic by those who prefer not to examine the mechanics too closely. But clarity is not cynicism. Clarity is orientation. The conscious player learns to tolerate the discomfort that comes with accurate perception. They resist the temptation to soften difficult truths simply because those truths conflict with popular narratives. This does not make them cold. It makes them effective, because every strategic decision begins with one requirement. The map must reflect the territory. If the map is distorted, if it hides certain structures or exaggerates others, the moves built on that map will inevitably fail. Commitment to reality keeps the map accurate. Strategic relationships sharpen the interpretation of that map. Strategic patience ensures the player waits for the right moment to act. When these three qualities begin operating together, something subtle but powerful occurs. Life no longer feels like a chaotic sequence of events pushing you in unpredictable directions. It begins to feel like a landscape. Complex, yes, sometimes turbulent, but increasingly understandable to someone who has taken the time to study it carefully. And in that landscape, every move you make becomes more deliberate, more informed, and far more difficult for the game itself to predict. Chapter 12. The piece waits to be moved. The player studies the board and acts. Imagine discovering that a game has been unfolding around you your entire life, and no one ever bothered to explain the rules. Not your teachers, not the institutions shaping your daily routine, not the systems rewarding certain behaviors, while quietly discouraging others. You were simply placed on the board and told to move forward. Work hard, follow the path, trust the structure, and for a long time, that instruction felt reasonable, until certain patterns started repeating. You noticed people with extraordinary intelligence remaining stuck in positions that never change. Meanwhile, others, sometimes less talented, sometimes less disciplined, rise quickly through structures that seem invisible to everyone else. Opportunities appear unevenly distributed. Power concentrates in specific places. Outcomes follow patterns that cannot be explained by effort alone. At first, this feels confusing. Eventually, it becomes unmistakable. The game was already in motion, and the most dangerous position in that game is not weakness. It is unconsciousness. Centuries ago, the political strategist Niccolo Machiavelli spent his life studying exactly this dynamic. While others preferred moral speeches about how the world should work, he examined how power actually moved through human systems. His conclusion was uncomfortable but precise. The game does not stop for anyone. It continues whether you understand it or not. It advances whether you approve of it or not. And every structure surrounding your life, governments, institutions, economies, cultural narratives, operates within that ongoing movement. Refusing to see it does not protect you. It simply leaves you exposed. But here is the crucial distinction Machiavelli tried to make clear. There are two fundamentally different roles a person can occupy inside this environment: the piece and the player. A piece moves when something else moves it. Its position changes because external forces push across the board: rules, expectations, incentives, pressures, cultural conditioning. The piece reacts. It adapts. It survives. But it does not direct the game. The player operates differently. The player studies. They observe the entire board before making a move. They analyze patterns, timing, relationships between positions, shifts in momentum. They recognize that every move influences multiple outcomes simultaneously. And because of that awareness, their actions carry intention. The player is not merely reacting to circumstances. They are responding strategically. This distinction is what Machiavelli described with the word virtù. Modern language often translates it as virtue, which creates enormous confusion. Virtù was never about moral goodness. It had nothing to do with appearing righteous or following social expectations. Virtù described a kind of psychological posture. It was the disciplined state of a person who accepts full responsibility for their position on the board, and then begins acting from that awareness with clarity. No illusions, no excuses, no waiting for the environment to become perfect before beginning. The individual with virtù does something far more practical. They start exactly where they are. They examine the circumstances surrounding them. They analyze incentives shaping the system they inhabit. They identify constraints and possibilities within the same environment that others experience as random or unfair. And then they search for the move available now, not the move that would exist in a perfect world, the move that exists in this one. This is where most people hesitate, because seeing the board clearly can be uncomfortable. It often reveals that certain structures reward behaviors we were never taught to study. It shows that power flows through networks, timing, perception, and positioning as much as through effort or talent. Some people respond to this realization with frustration. Others retreat into comforting explanations that allow them to ignore the patterns. But the conscious player responds differently. They study. They observe how decisions ripple through systems. They notice how narratives influence perception, how alliances alter trajectories, how timing determines whether an action succeeds or fails. Over time, something changes internally. The environment that once felt chaotic begins to reveal structure. What once appeared random begins to show rhythm. This does not mean the player suddenly controls everything around them. No one does. The forces shaping human systems are too complex for complete mastery. But clarity produces leverage. When you understand the board, even partially, your moves become more precise. Energy stops scattering across reactions and begins concentrating on actions that actually shift position. You stop wishing you were in a different place. You start working intelligently from the position you already occupy. That shift alone transforms the experience of the game, because the piece waits. It waits for permission, for approval, for the moment someone else decides its direction. The player studies. They study until the structure becomes legible enough to act. They study until the timing reveals itself. They study until the next move, however small, becomes clear. And then they move, not recklessly, not emotionally, deliberately. Every serious strategist eventually reaches this moment of recognition. The realization that the board was always there, that the forces shaping outcomes were always operating beneath the surface of everyday life, that the patterns influencing opportunity were never hidden, only unnoticed. At that point, the question becomes unavoidable. Now that you see the board, what will you do with that awareness? Some people step back into the comfort of unconscious participation. They return to the role they already understand, the role where outcomes feel mysterious and responsibility feels limited. Others make a different choice. They accept the complexity. They accept the responsibility that comes with seeing clearly, and they begin the quiet work of learning the game, not to dominate it, not to rage against it, but to participate in it consciously. The board has always been moving. The pieces have always been shifting. The structures influencing your life have never paused for explanation. But now something important has changed. You can see them. And the moment you begin seeing the board clearly, you are no longer just another piece waiting to be moved. Chapter 1. The people who hold power without saying a word. Watch carefully the next time someone powerful walks into a room. Not loud power, not the kind that announces itself with stories, status, or performance. Something quieter than that. The kind that shifts the atmosphere before a single word is spoken. You will notice something subtle. They are not trying to capture attention. They are not rushing to prove themselves. They are not filling every silence with explanation. And strangely, that restraint pulls attention toward them more strongly than noise ever could. Most people misunderstand influence. They think power comes from what you project outward: confidence, charisma, dominance, control. But the deeper mechanics of human psychology operate differently. Real authority is often built on something far less visible. It is built on what a person chooses not to give away. There is a particular moment in every social environment when people unconsciously scan for signals. Who is stable? Who is reactive? Who needs validation? Who is trying too hard to belong? And the human nervous system is incredibly skilled at detecting this. When someone constantly explains themselves, constantly reassures, constantly performs availability, something subtle happens in the minds of everyone around them. Their energy becomes predictable, accessible, easy to consume. Not maliciously, not consciously, but predictability slowly dissolves perceived value. This is one of the oldest patterns in human interaction. Scarcity sharpens attention. Abundance dulls it. When something is always present, always responsive, always accommodating, the brain stops registering it as something rare or meaningful. It becomes background. This is why certain people seem to command a room without ever raising their voice. They are not trying to occupy every space. They are comfortable allowing space to exist. And that small difference changes everything. Because silence does something powerful to the human mind. It forces interpretation. When someone explains themselves endlessly, the meaning of their behavior is already supplied. There is no mystery left for others to process. But when someone leaves small gaps, pauses, restraint, unanswered space, the minds around them begin filling those gaps automatically. Curiosity appears. Attention sharpens. People begin asking themselves questions they never asked before. Why are they so calm? Why don't they feel the need to react? What do they know that others don't? And slowly, almost invisibly, the dynamic begins to shift. But this shift has nothing to do with manipulation. It is not about games or calculated distance. In fact, the individuals who carry this kind of presence are usually doing something far simpler. They are protecting their internal energy. Most people spend their days leaking attention everywhere. Every message answered instantly. Every criticism addressed immediately. Every silence filled with reassurance. Every emotional tension resolved as quickly as possible. It feels responsible. It feels polite. But beneath the surface, something else is happening. Your energy, your attention, your emotional availability, your responsiveness becomes an open system. Anyone can access it at any time. And once people learn that access is unlimited, they stop recognizing it as something valuable. Think about the psychology of expectation for a moment. If someone answers every message instantly for months, what happens the one day they respond slowly? The reaction is rarely appreciation for their consistency. Instead, people notice a deviation. They question it. They wonder if something is wrong. The standard quietly shifts from gratitude to entitlement. This is how energetic exhaustion begins. Not because people around you are cruel, not because relationships are malicious, but because the human brain adapts quickly to what becomes normal. Constant availability becomes a baseline. And when the baseline shifts like that, something essential disappears. the sense that your presence is a privilege rather than a guarantee. Now observe what happens when that pattern changes. Not dramatically, not through confrontation, simply through subtle recalibration. A person becomes slightly less reactive. They stop explaining every decision. They allow silence to remain silence. And almost immediately the environment begins reorganizing itself. People who once assumed endless access begin noticing the space, the absence, the pause where automatic responses used to live. And the brain does what always does when certainty disappears. It pays attention. This is the quiet moment where psychological gravity changes direction. Because when someone no longer broadcasts their availability, their presence gains weight. Their attention becomes selective. Their responses feel intentional. And suddenly the same people who once overlooked them begin adjusting their own behavior. Not because they were instructed to, because human psychology naturally orients toward what feels stable and self-contained. There is another layer to this that most people overlook. When someone refuses to react impulsively, they interrupt the emotional feedback loops that dominate everyday interaction. Arguments lose their fuel. Manipulation loses its leverage. Drama loses its audience. Silence becomes a kind of boundary. Not aggressive, not defensive, just present. And boundaries like this are deeply unsettling for people who are used to easy access. They cannot provoke the reaction they expect. They cannot trigger the emotional responses that normally give them a sense of control. So the dynamic changes again. Sometimes people step closer, curious about the shift. Sometimes they pull away, uncomfortable with the lack of predictability. But either way, the environment reorganizes itself around the person who is no longer leaking energy in every direction. This is the part most people misunderstand. Withholding is not about punishment. It is about alignment. When your energy is constantly available, it stops reflecting your values. It becomes a reflex. But when your presence becomes intentional, when you give attention only where it truly belongs, every interaction begins carrying more weight. Your silence says something. Your availability says something. Even your absence says something. And the people around you begin responding to those signals, whether they realize it or not. You may have experienced this before without recognizing what was happening. A moment when you stopped chasing conversation that always drained you. A moment when you resisted the urge to justify yourself. A moment when you allowed someone else to sit with the consequences of their own behavior instead of rushing in to repair it. At first it feels uncomfortable. Silence often does. The nervous system is used to filling space quickly. It interprets quiet as tension that must be resolved. But when you resist that impulse, something important happens internally. You regain authorship of your energy. Your attention stops being reactive. Your presence stops being automatic. And slowly, a new form of stability begins forming beneath your behavior. Not loud confidence. Something quieter. Something that does not require validation. And that is the presence people feel when someone walks into a room and commands it without saying a word. It is not charisma. It is not status. It is not performance. It is the simple, disciplined decision to stop giving away energy that was never meant to belong to everyone. Chapter 2. The moment before you speak holds more power than the words that follow. There's a moment most people miss entirely. It happens in the space between stimulus and response. A message appears on your phone. A comment lands that feels sharp. Someone challenges you, misunderstands you, pushes on a nerve they didn't even realize existed. Your body reacts instantly. Your chest tightens. Your mind begins constructing a reply before you've consciously decided to speak. Words assemble themselves almost automatically. Explanations, defenses, corrections, emotional counterattacks. And in most cases, the response leaves your mouth or your keyboard within seconds. But hidden inside that small space before the reaction, the pause most people rush past, sits one of the most powerful levers you possess over your own life. That moment before you speak. Most people believe power lives in the response itself, in saying the right thing, in delivering the perfect argument, in proving a point with clarity and force. But the deeper mechanics of human interaction suggest something very different. The real power is in deciding whether a response deserves your energy at all. Think about how many conversations you participated in where the real outcome had already been decided before a single word was spoken. Someone was committed to misunderstanding you. Someone else was committed to provoking a reaction. The exchange wasn't about truth or clarity. It was about emotional momentum. And the moment you react automatically, you step directly into that momentum. You feed it. This pattern appears everywhere. In arguments between partners, in office dynamics, in social media debates that spiral endlessly without resolution, in subtle psychological games that unfold between people who know exactly which emotional buttons to press. Reaction becomes predictable. Predictability becomes leverage. And suddenly your emotional responses are no longer expressions of your values. They are responses to someone else's stimulus. This is where the pause becomes transformative, when you interrupt the automatic reaction. Even for a few seconds, something remarkable happens inside the brain. The emotional surge that demanded immediate expression begins to settle. The part of the mind responsible for reflection and evaluation comes back online. Instead of reacting, you begin observing. And observation changes everything. Because the moment you observe a situation, rather than immediately participating in it, you begin to see the structure beneath it. You notice the tone of the message rather than just its content. You notice the emotional hook someone attempted to use. You notice your own internal trigger, the place where your nervous system wanted to jump into defense. This is exactly the kind of psychological awareness hinted at throughout the ideas behind script F. When a person refuses to be pulled into automatic emotional exchanges, the dynamic around them begins to change. Not because they became cold, because they became conscious. Imagine something simple. A group chat where you have always been the fastest responder. Messages arrive, and you reply immediately. You explain yourself quickly. You smooth over tension before it grows. For months, maybe years, that pattern continues. Then one day, you don't respond immediately. You read the message. You feel the familiar urge to jump in and clarify. But instead, you pause. You let the moment breathe. Nothing dramatic happens outwardly, but internally, something important shifts. You realize the world does not collapse if you take a minute to think. You realize the urgency was mostly psychological. And the moment you stop feeding that urgency with immediate responses, the entire emotional tempo of the interaction slows down. Sometimes people will notice. Someone might ask if everything is okay. Someone might send another message seeking reassurance. But what they are actually reacting to is not silence itself. They are reacting to the absence of the pattern they expected. And expectation is one of the strongest invisible forces governing human relationships. When people know exactly how you will react, they unconsciously begin steering interactions in ways that produce those reactions, not always maliciously, often without realizing it. But the loop exists. Predictable reaction creates predictable dynamics. Silence disrupts them. When you pause before speaking, the script that usually runs between two people suddenly has missing lines. The other person expected immediate explanation, immediate emotional response, immediate validation of their interpretation. Instead, they receive stillness, and stillness forces people to reconsider their position. This is why silence can feel unsettling in moments of tension. Human beings are wired to interpret silence as information. When someone stops reacting the way we expect, our brains begin searching for meaning. Did they change their mind? Did they see something I didn't? Did I misread the situation? These questions appear automatically, and suddenly the emotional gravity of the interaction shifts. But the most important transformation does not happen outside you. It happens within. Because the moment you realize you do not have to react immediately, you reclaim something that was quietly slipping away in many areas of your life. Choice. Choice over what deserves your attention. Choice over which conversations are worth entering. Choice over how much emotional energy a situation truly merits. Without that pause, reaction feels inevitable. With a pause, reaction becomes optional. That difference may sound small, but psychologically it is enormous. It means your emotions are no longer steering every interaction. Your attention becomes deliberate rather than automatic. And the more often you practice that small gap before responding, the more stable your internal state becomes in situations that once pulled you into unnecessary conflict. The silence itself also communicates something powerful. Not aggression, not avoidance, clarity. It signals that your value is not dependent on defending yourself in every moment. That your identity does not collapse if someone misunderstands you temporarily. That your attention is not an unlimited resource available to every stimulus that crosses your path. In environments where people are used to constant reaction, that kind of composure stands out immediately. Some will respect it, some will be confused by it, and some may even attempt to provoke a reaction more strongly, simply because the absence of your usual response disrupts the rhythm they were accustomed to. But over time, something consistent emerges. People begin approaching you differently. The space you allow before speaking communicates that your attention has weight, that your responses are considered rather than automatic. And when you do choose to speak, your words carry more impact precisely because they were not delivered impulsively. The paradox is simple. When every thought is expressed immediately, words lose significance. When speech follows reflection, it gains precision. And the small, almost invisible moment before you respond, the breath you take instead of the reply you fire off, becomes a place where your power quietly returns to you. Because sometimes the most commanding thing you can do in a charged moment is not to argue harder, explain faster, or defend more aggressively. Sometimes the most commanding thing you can do is nothing at all, not the silence of avoidance. The silence of someone who understands that their energy is too valuable to spend on every impulse that demands it. Chapter 3. They are not connecting with you. They are connecting with your patterns. Look closely at the relationships in your life, and you will begin to notice something unsettling. Most interactions are not happening between two fully conscious individuals. They are happening between two sets of patterns. A tone triggers a familiar reaction. A pause triggers a familiar explanation. A certain type of criticism pulls the same emotional response every single time. The conversation feels spontaneous. But beneath the surface, it follows a script that has been rehearsed hundreds of times. And the moment someone learns your script, they also learn how to influence you. Not always intentionally, not always maliciously, but the mechanism is there. Human beings are pattern recognition machines. Our brains are constantly mapping the behavior of the people around us. We track emotional reactions, communication styles, threshold for conflict, and the subtle cues that signal when someone will soften, withdraw, or push back. Over time, this map becomes incredibly accurate. Someone learns that if they withdraw slightly, you will chase the conversation to repair it. They learn that if they raise their voice, you will shift into explanation mode. They learn that a certain tone of disappointment will make you apologize even when you were not wrong. And once that map is built, interaction stops being discovery. It becomes prediction. This is why so many relationships eventually feel exhausting without anyone fully understanding why. The emotional exchange is no longer happening between two present individuals. It is happening between expectations that have been reinforced over years. The dependable one will fix the problem. The agreeable one will smooth the tension. The empathetic one will absorb the emotional weight. If you have ever been the person who keeps peace in every room, you know exactly how this pattern forms. At first, it feels generous, responsible, even admirable. You respond quickly when someone is upset. You clarify misunderstandings immediately. You apologize early just to move the situation forward. But something subtle happens when this pattern repeats long enough. People stop responding to you as a person. They start responding to the role you reliably play. Your reaction becomes part of the structure of a relationship. The moment tension appears, everyone unconsciously expects the same emotional choreography to unfold. You will explain. You will reassure. You will close the gap. And because the pattern is so reliable, the people around you begin relying on it more than they rely on genuine communication. This is a quiet point where connection begins to fade. Not because anyone intends harm, but because the interaction is no longer about discovering each other in the moment. It is about activating the reactions everyone has come to expect. In psychological terms, your emotional responses become conditioned signals. Press the right button, receive the expected reaction. Someone withdraws, you reach out. Someone criticizes, you defend. Someone becomes silent. You fill the space with explanation. Over time, the pattern becomes so automatic that it feels like personality. But it is not personality. It is programming. And once someone knows exactly how to trigger your emotional system, they possess a form of leverage over your behavior. Again, this leverage is often unconscious. Many people do not even realize they are doing it, but the effect is real. Predictability gives other people influence over your internal state. Think about how many times you have replayed a conversation in your mind long after it ended. How many hours of attention have been spent analyzing a tone of voice, a short message, or a delayed reply? Those moments feel like emotional involvement, but very often they are simply the echo of a pattern being activated. This is the deeper insight hinted at in Script F. When someone becomes extremely predictable emotionally, they become easier to steer, not because they are weak, because their responses have become automatic. And automatic reactions can be anticipated. Now imagine something different. The familiar situation appears again. The comment that usually irritates you. The subtle guilt trigger someone has used before. The moment where you would normally explain yourself in detail. But this time the pattern does not fire. You pause, not to suppress emotion, but to observe it. You feel the impulse to react. The same impulse that has appeared countless times before, but instead of acting on it, you allow it to pass through you. No immediate defense, no elaborate explanation, no attempt to repair someone else's interpretation, just quiet attention. And something interesting happens in that silence. The other person loses the script they were expecting. The emotional rhythm they were relying on suddenly collapses. They anticipated the usual sequence of reactions, but the sequence never begins, so the conversation stalls. You might notice a brief moment of confusion, a shift in tone, sometimes even discomfort. That discomfort is not caused by your silence itself. It is caused by the disappearance of the pattern. For the first time, the interaction is no longer predictable, and unpredictability forces people to re-engage consciously. They can no longer rely on the automatic emotional response they were used to receiving. The familiar dynamic has been interrupted. This interruption is where power quietly returns to you, because once your reactions stop being automatic, they stop being controllable. Your emotional availability becomes intentional rather than reflexive. Your attention is no longer distributed